Hello there and welcome to History for Lunatics. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Settle in somewhere comfortable if you can. Maybe you are listening from a quiet room, maybe from the edge of sleep, maybe with the lights low and the world outside already gone still. And tonight we're going into a part of American history that does not feel like the clean, polished version of the country people are usually handed. We are not going to a marble building in Washington. We are not going to a president's desk or a courtroom or a battlefield where the uniforms are neat and the lines are easy to understand. We're going into the mountains of southern West Virginia, into coal country, into narrow valleys where the houses belong to the company, the stores belong to the company, the police often answer to the company, and the men who went underground before sunrise sometimes came back, coughing black dust into a room they did not truly own. And at the centre of this story is a strange and almost unbelievable sight. Thousands of coal miners, many of them poor, tired, armed, and wearing red bandanas around their necks, marching across the hills as if the mountains themselves had finally decided to move. What time is it where you are right now? Is it late enough that the room has softened around the edges? Are you somewhere warm, somewhere quiet, somewhere far away from those steep green ridges where men once listened for gunfire through the trees? I always like to imagine where these stories are landing, because history changes a little, depending on where you hear it from. A story about a mine sounds different if you've worked with your hands all day. A story about debt sounds different if you have ever owed money you could not easily repay. A story about men walking toward danger sounds different if you have ever felt trapped by something larger than yourself. That is part of what makes this story worth telling slowly. The Battle of Blair Mountain was not just a fight between miners and guards. It was not just a labour dispute that got out of hand. It was a moment when ordinary working men looked at the richest and most powerful interests in their world and decided, in a way that was dangerous and desperate and deeply human, that they could not keep living under them forever. Before we go any farther, I just want to say, if this kind of storytelling speaks to you, if you like history told not as a list of dates but as a place you can almost step inside, it would mean a lot if you hit the subscribe button and gave this video a like. You do not have to do it right now. Do it when you feel that quiet pull, when something in the story makes you pause for a second and think, I did not know people lived through that. And if you want to leave a comment telling me where you are listening from tonight, I genuinely love reading those. It is a strange and lovely thing knowing that a story from a West Virginia mountain can travel into bedrooms, kitchens, buses, night shifts, and little corners of the world its people never saw. Now, let the room settle a little. Let the noise outside fall away if it can. And let us go back to the summer of 1921, to a place where the roads were rough, the hills were steep, and the difference between a miner and a rich man was not just money. It was who got to breathe clean air, who got to leave when they wanted, who got protected by the law, and who discovered that the law could arrive at his door carrying someone else's orders. To understand why men went to Blair Mountain, you have to first understand that they did not wake up one morning looking for a war. Most men do not. Most working men want a wage that can keep food on the table, a home that cannot be taken from them for speaking too loudly, a body that can survive the job it is sent into, and a little dignity at the end of the day. That sounds modest, almost painfully modest. But in the coal fields of southern West Virginia in the early 1900s, even that could feel like asking for too much. The coal companies had not simply built mines there. They had built whole worlds. They carved rail lines through valleys, opened seams in the mountains, put up rows of company houses, opened company stores, hired company doctors, brought in company police, and in some towns even controlled the school, the church building, the post office, and the road that led out. A miner might live in a house owned by the same company that paid him. He might buy food from a store owned by the same company that set his wages. He might be paid partly in scrip, a kind of private money that could only be spent at the company store, where prices were often higher than they would be in an independent town. He might owe rent, owe the store, owe the doctor, O for his tools, O for the powder used to blast coal from the seam, and by the end of the month discover that after risking his life underground, the company still considered him behind. There is a word people use for that kind of life now, and it is easy to say it quickly: exploitation. But words like that can become too smooth. They can roll past us without making us feel the daily reality underneath them. So let us slow it down. Picture a miner standing at dawn outside a wooden company house, lunch pail in hand, boots already stained, his wife awake behind him because she's been up making whatever food can be packed and carried into the mine. The children may still be sleeping, or pretending to. The air in the valley is damp and cool. Smoke sits low between the houses. Somewhere nearby a mule shifts and snorts. The man walks toward the mine opening, not because he loves coal, not because he believes in the greatness of industry, not because he has carefully chosen this work from a wide field of options, but because the mountains have been brought above him and hollowed beneath him, and this is where the paycheck comes from. He goes underground knowing that a fall of slate can crush a man without warning, that gas can collect invisibly, that explosions can turn tunnels into graves, that black lung is not a dramatic accident but a slow theft of breath. And when the shift is over, if he comes home, he may find that the money he earned has already begun travelling back to the same hands that paid it. This is the part that makes the coalfields different from many other workplaces in American history. The conflict did not end at the mine mouth. It followed men home. In a normal town, at least in theory, a worker could leave the workplace and enter a private life. In a company town, the boundary was much thinner. The company house was part of the job. The company store was part of the job. The debt was part of the job. The mine guards who watched for union organisers were part of the job. The fear of eviction was part of the job. If a miner tried to join a union, he was not merely risking a conversation with his boss. He could be blacklisted, thrown out of his home, watched, threatened, beaten, or worse. His wife and children could be put out with him. The family's furniture could be carried into the road, and in the narrow valleys, where everyone knew who had spoken to whom and which man had attended which meeting, fear did not need to shout. It could sit quietly on a porch and be understood by everyone who passed. By 1921, coal was not a small business. It was the fuel of modern America. Coal-powered factories, coal-moved trains. Coal heated homes, coal made steel possible, and steel made railroads, bridges, skyscrapers, weapons, and the visible bones of the modern nation. The men who owned and controlled coal were not local shopkeepers with dusty ledgers and modest ambitions. They were part of a national system of banks, railroads, industrial companies, and political influence. Their wealth moved upward from the dark seams of Appalachia into boardrooms far away, into investment houses, into cities where the people who benefited from coal might never see the inside of a mine or the face of a boy carrying a lunch pail beside his father. That distance matters. It is easier to be ruthless when the suffering that makes your fortune happens out of sight. It is easier to call miners troublesome when you do not hear the coughing at night. It is easier to talk about order when the disorder of daily life belongs to someone else. Still, the miners were not helpless in the simple way people sometimes imagine poor workers to be helpless. They had their own forms of power, and one of them was memory. Many came from families and communities where rifles were common tools, not symbols. They knew the mountains intimately. They knew which ridges could be crossed and which hollows twisted behind a line of trees. Some were veterans of the First World War and had returned from Europe with military experience, discipline, and a bitter awareness that a man could be asked to fight for democracy overseas and then come home to a place where his own voice counted for very little. Others were immigrants from Italy, Hungary, Poland, and other parts of Europe, men who had been sold the promise of American wages and discovered the company town waiting behind the advertisement. Black miners worked beside white miners in the coalfields as well, in a nation still violently segregated in so many public places, and while racism did not disappear underground, the mine created a brutal kind of shared dependence. A rooffall did not ask a man's colour. Bad air did not care about his accent. A company store could trap all of them. That is one of the reasons the red bandana became such a powerful image in this story. The miners tied red cloth around their necks, partly for identification, partly as a sign of unity, and partly because when men gather in large numbers, they need some way to know one another in the confusion. From that came the word redneck, long before it became the insult or identity marker people use in later American culture. In this moment, it meant something very specific. It meant a miner marching with other miners. It meant a man who had tied himself visibly to a cause. It meant that if he was seen, he could be identified. There was courage in that, and danger too. A red bandana was not armour. It did not stop bullets. It did not protect a family from eviction. It did not turn a poor man into a powerful one. But it told the men beside him that he had chosen to be counted, and in a world where the companies wanted workers isolated, frightened and replaceable, being counted together was no small thing. The road to Blair Mountain passed through years of smaller humiliations and sharper violence. It passed through strikes that were broken, tents that were attacked, families that were pushed out, organisers who were beaten, and local officials who often seemed less like neutral guardians of the law than armed extensions of coal power. The Baldwin Felts Detective Agency became one of the most feared names in the coalfields. Its agents worked for mine operators as guards, strikebreakers, and enforcers, and their presence told miners that the company's reach did not stop at a payroll office. If a union organiser entered a camp, guards might follow. If miners gathered, guards might listen. If someone resisted eviction, guards might arrive with guns. This was the kind of pressure that turns ordinary grievances into something hotter. People can endure low wages for a long time if they believe tomorrow might be better. They can endure danger if they think the danger is shared honestly. They can endure hard work if they feel they are still treated as human beings. But when hardship is joined to contempt, when poverty is enforced by men with rifles, when the law feels like a locked door guarded by the people who profit from keeping it shut, anger begins to collect. And anger in the mountains did not collect in a straight line. It moved through hollows and union halls, through whispered conversations outside company stores, through funerals, through newspaper reports, through men returning from jail, through women watching furniture dumped beside a road, through children learning too early that their home depended on their father's silence. It moved slowly until it did not. That is often how these things happen. Later, people search for the single spark, the one moment when everything began. But for the miners, the spark fell on ground that had been drying for years. Every unpaid hour, every dangerous seam, every company guard, every eviction, every insult, every dead man pulled from underground had made the coalfields ready to burn. By the time the miners began gathering near Marmot in August of 1921, the United States had already seen more than enough labour violence to know that industry could produce battlefields as surely as nations could. The country had seen the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, the Haymarket Affair, Homestead, Pullman, Ludlow. Again and again, working people had collided with private power, police power, state militias, and sometimes federal troops. But Blair Mountain would become something larger and stranger than most Americans were prepared to imagine. This was not a few men outside a factory gate. This was not a brief clash in a street. This was thousands of armed miners moving across the land with a purpose, trying to reach Mingo County, where martial law and anti-union repression had turned the coalfields into a place that felt occupied. They were going, as they understood it, to free fellow miners, to confront the mine guard system, and to open the southern coalfields to union organisation. Their enemies understood it differently. To the coal operators and the officials aligned with them, this was rebellion. This was an army of working men threatening property, order, and the authority of those who had always expected to command. Imagine hearing the news travel ahead of them. Men are coming, not one or two, not a handful, thousands. They're coming down roads and over ridges. Some carry old hunting rifles. Some carry military weapons brought back from war. Some have little more than determination and the belief that enough men moving together might become something no sheriff could easily stop. There would have been fear on both sides, though not the same kind. The miners feared ambush, arrest, betrayal, and the possibility that the government would side against them as it so often had. The coal men feared losing control, not only of a county or a road, but of the whole arrangement that made their world profitable. If miners in Logan and Mingo could organise, if company authority could be challenged in its strongest places, then the old order might begin to crack. That was the real terror for the rich and powerful, not simply that men had guns. Men in America had guns everywhere. The terror was that these men had found a common purpose. In Logan County, Sheriff Don Chafin prepared to stop them. Chafin was not just a local lawman in the plain small-town sense. He was a political boss with deep ties to coal interests, and he commanded a force of deputies, mine guards, volunteers, and armed defenders positioned along the ridges. The land itself became part of the defence. Blair Mountain was not a flat field where two sides could see each other clearly. It was a thick wooded barrier, a high ridge controlling the approaches into Logan County. Men could hide in trees. Bullets could come from places no one could immediately see. A few defenders in good positions could slow many attackers below them. The mountain did not belong to either side in a moral sense, but tactically it favoured those waiting on top of it. And so the miners, who had spent their lives going down into the earth to make rich men richer, now found themselves climbing upward toward men hired and organised to keep them out. There is something almost unbearable about that image when you sit with it. The miner's life was already a kind of war, but one that had been disguised as employment. Every day he entered darkness. Every day he gambled his body against stone, gas, dust, machinery, and the pace demanded by men who might never descend with him. Every day his wife lived with the possibility that a sound from the mine or a knock at the door could change the family forever. And yet when those miners finally marched in the open, when the conflict became visible enough that newspapers could no longer ignore it, the country looked at them with alarm, as if the violence had begun only when workers picked up rifles. That is one of the oldest tricks in history. The slow violence of hunger, debt, danger, and humiliation is treated as normal. The sudden resistance to it is treated as shocking. But to be fair to the full human difficulty of the story, the march to Blair Mountain was not simple heroism. It was dangerous. It was armed. It frightened people who lived in the path of it. It created the possibility of bloodshed on a scale that could have become even worse than it did. Not every miner agreed with every decision. Not every union leader wanted the same thing at the same time. Mother Jones, old, fierce, legendary, and often associated with the miners' struggles, urged restraint at points because she understood what federal intervention might mean. There were rumours, false reports, confused messages, and the usual fog that settles over any mass movement when thousands of frightened, angry men try to act as one body. To tell this story honestly, we do not need to pretend that every choice was wise or every man noble. People under pressure are still people. They misjudge, exaggerate, panic, boast, turn brave, turn afraid, and keep moving anyway. That is what makes history human instead of clean. What is clear is that by late August, the coalfields had reached a point where peace, if that is what one wants to call the silence before open fighting, could no longer hold. The miners were no longer content to wait for distant sympathy. The operators were not willing to yield control. Local power was armed. Worker anger was armed. The mountain stood between them, and the federal government, watching from a distance at first, would soon be pulled into the question that powerful countries often hate to answer plainly. When poor men and rich men go to war inside the same nation, whose side does the state protect? For now, stay with the road before the first full roar of the battle. Stay with the men walking, boots striking dirt, rifles shifting against shoulders, red cloth at their throats, sweat under their collars, the heavy green hills rising around them. Some would have joked as they walked, because men joke when they are afraid and do not want to say so. Some would have thought of wives and children behind them. Some would have imagined victory in the simple terms, a union recognised, jailed men freed, mine guards pushed back, the coalfields opened. Some may not have imagined the end at all. They were moving because stopping felt too much like surrendering to the same life they had already endured for too long. Behind them were the coal camps and company towns, the debts and guards and rules that had made ordinary existence feel like captivity. Ahead of them was Logan County, Blair Mountain, and a line of armed men waiting in the trees. And before we climb that ridge with them, before the shooting begins and the newspapers turn the miners into a national emergency, we need to go back into the coal camps themselves, into the places where this war was made long before anyone called it one. Because Blair Mountain did not begin on Blair Mountain. It began in the company town, in the store ledger, in the mine shaft, in the rented house, in the moment a man realised that even after a full day underground, he still belonged to someone else's arithmetic. Before any miner started up the road toward Blair Mountain, before the rifles were lifted and the red bandanas were tied, and the newspapers began describing southern West Virginia as if a foreign army had appeared inside the United States, there was the coal camp. That is where this story really begins. Not on the ridge, not in the gun smoke, not with marching men seen from a distance and turned into a symbol after the fact. It begins in a narrow hollow where the houses sat in a line beside the tracks, where coal dust found its way into the curtains, the bedding, the cracks of the floorboards, the lungs of the men, and the hands of the children who played too close to the road. It begins in a place that looked like a town if you saw it quickly, but was not really a town in the way most of us understand that word. A town belongs, at least a little, to the people who live in it. A coal camp belonged to the company. That difference mattered every hour of the day. The company owned the mine, of course, that part is obvious, but in many coal camps across southern West Virginia, the company also owned the houses where miners slept, the store where their wives bought flour and beans and coffee, the school where their children learned their letters, the church building where prayers were said, the doctor who treated the broken bones and bad lungs, the land under everyone's feet, and sometimes even the road out. A man could leave the mine at the end of his shift and still not leave the company. He stepped out of the dark mouth of the mountain and walked back into another kind of enclosure, one made of rent, credit, store accounts, guards, contracts, and the simple fact that if he angered the wrong person, his family could be told to get out. It is easy to imagine poverty as emptiness, as people simply not having enough. But the poverty of the coal camps was more complicated than that. It was full of obligations. A miner might have a roof over his head, but the roof was rented from the company. He might have food on the table, but much of it came from the company store. He might have a job, but the job required tools, powder, lamps, oil, and sometimes medical arrangements that could all pull money back from his wages before his wife ever saw what was left. He might be paid in cash, or partly in scrip, the private money of the company, useful mostly where the company allowed it to be useful. And this is where the trap begins to show itself. A person who is hungry can sometimes move. A person who owes money to the store lives in a company house, has children in a company camp, and works for the same men who control the landlord. Merchant and guard at the same time is not simply poor, he is tied down. Picture one of those mornings in the years before Blair Mountain. The valley is still grey. The sun has not fully climbed over the ridge because in those hollows daylight arrives late and leaves early, blocked by the mountains that make the place beautiful from a distance and difficult from within. A row of houses stands close to the tracks, plain wooden structures, some painted, some weathered, some patched in the way working families patch things because replacement is rarely an option. Inside one of them, a miner is pulling on his clothes. His wife has already been awake. She has packed a lunch in a tin pail, maybe beans, bread, a piece of meat if they have it, coffee if they can spare it. The children sleep in corners or in beds shared by more than one body. The house is not silent. Houses with children never are, even when everyone is trying not to wake. There is the scrape of a chair, the small clatter of a stove, the cough that has become part of the household's morning music. The man steps outside and joins other men moving in the same direction. They do not need to speak much. The mine is waiting, and the mine has no patience. The work itself was dangerous in ways that modern people can understand in general, but rarely feel in detail. A mine was not simply a dark workplace. It was a place where the ceiling could come down. It was a place where gas could gather without announcing itself, where a spark or open flame could turn the air into a weapon, where machinery and mules and bad timbering and rushing production could turn a normal shift into the last day of a man's life. Coal dust entered the lungs and stayed there. The body carried the mine home. A man's cough, his blackened spit, the stiffness in his back, the scars on his hands, the permanent bend of his shoulders, these were not separate from wages. They were the hidden costs of the coal that heated cities and drove trains and fed factories far away. The nation saw coal as fuel. The miner knew it as weight. And here is something that has to be understood slowly. The miners were paid for coal, but the company often controlled how that coal was weighed and counted. A man could spend a day cutting, loading and risking himself underground, and then watch the value of his labour depend on scales he did not control, rules he did not write, deductions he could not easily challenge. If a load was judged to contain too much slate or waste, he could lose pay. If the company doctor, store, rent or supplies took their share, the final amount could shrink before it reached the kitchen table. The number on a pay envelope was not just money. It was a judgment from a system in which the worker had very little power to question the judge. Women understood this just as clearly as men did, because the debt came home to them. The store ledger was not an idea. It was flour, meal, shoes, medicine, lamp oil, cloth, and the embarrassing knowledge that the family had to ask again. A miner's wife might walk into the company store knowing the clerk knew the state of her account, knew whether her husband had worked steadily, knew whether the family was behind. There is a particular kind of humiliation in buying necessities on credit from the same power that keeps you poor. It is not the same as shopping. It is closer to being inspected. Every sack of flour carries a little weight beyond its pounds. Every purchase is another line written down somewhere. In a place where people could not freely choose another store, prices were not just prices. They were a form of control. The company store has become almost a symbol now, something people mention in a phrase, as if everyone understands it already. But we should not pass over it too quickly. A store in an ordinary town has to compete, at least somewhat, with other places a person might spend money. A company store in an isolated coal camp often did not. The nearest independent store might be miles away over rough roads, and if the miner was paid in company scrip, the distance did not matter much anyway. His money had been designed to return to the company. That is the terrible neatness of the system. The company paid the miner, rented him a house, sold him his food, recorded his debt, and used the debt to keep him working. It was a circle, and many men spent their lives inside it. This is why leaving was not as simple as pack in a bag. We sometimes look back from the outside and ask why people stayed in hard places. Why not move? Why not find other work? Why not walk away from a mine owner who treated men as if they were replaceable parts of a machine? But leaving required money. Leaving required transportation. Leaving required a place to go, someone to receive you, another employer willing to hire you, and no blacklist following your name down the rail line. A miner with a wife, children, unpaid store debt, and no savings could not simply stroll out of the camp and begin again as if America were a wide-open door. The country was large, yes, but working people knew that bigness does not help much when your pockets are empty, and your children need supper tonight. The railroad that carried coal away from the mountains could carry people too, but a ticket cost money, and every mile away from the camp was a mile into uncertainty. For immigrant miners, the trap could feel even tighter. Many had come to the coalfields after hearing promises of steady work and decent wages. Some had arrived through labour agents who recruited in cities and immigrant neighbourhoods, offering the mine as an entry point into American life. They came speaking Italian, Hungarian, Polish, Slovak, Lithuanian, and other languages. They brought saints' medals, recipes, work songs, memories of villages, and expectations shaped by hunger, war, or landlessness in Europe. In the coal camps they found work, yes, but also suspicion, segregation by language or nationality, and a labour system that could use difference as a weapon. If workers did not understand one another, they were easier to divide. If one group could be turned against another, the company was safer. But underground, men learned one another in practical ways. A warning shout, a shared tool, a hand extended in a dangerous place. These do not require perfect English. The mine could divide men through competition, but it could also teach them that survival depended on the man beside you. Black miners faced another version of that same hard bargain. In the Jim Crow era, when so much of American life was organised around racial separation and threat, coal companies sometimes recruited black workers to break strikes or to fill dangerous jobs, hoping racial division would weaken labour unity. But the coalfields did not obey any simple story. Black miners built communities, raised families, joined unions, resisted exploitation, and worked in conditions that could kill them just as quickly as anyone else. The camps were often segregated, the society around them deeply racist, and violence was never far from the surface. Yet the struggle over unionisation created moments of cooperation that frightened coal operators because it crossed the lines they preferred to keep sharp. A white miner, a black miner, and an immigrant miner did not suddenly become equals in every part of life because they entered the same union hall. History is not that clean, but they could come to understand that the company benefited when they mistrusted one another, and that realisation had power. Children grew up inside this world as if it were normal, because children always begin by believing their world is the world. They learned the sound of the mine whistle. They learned which men had lost fingers or brothers. They learned that certain conversations became quieter when guards passed near. They learned that the company store was where food came from, that the company house was where they slept, that the company name was painted or spoken or implied everywhere. Some boys went into the mines early, too early by any decent measure, because family wages needed help, and childhood in a coal camp did not stretch as long as childhood does in safer places. A boy might begin by carrying supplies, tending doors, working around mules, learning the habits of underground labour before his body had finished growing. He did not need a lecture on class conflict. He saw it in the dust on his father's face and the worry in his mother's eyes at the end of the month. The houses themselves told part of the story. Company housing varied from camp to camp. Some homes were better built than others. Some families kept them with pride, as people do even when the structure is not truly theirs. Curtains were hung. Gardens were planted. Porches became places of talk. Women scrubbed, cooked, sewed, washed, mended, raised children, nursed sick husbands, and built a domestic life inside walls owned by someone else. That fact did not make the life inside the house unreal. It made it more fragile. A family could love a home they did not own. A child could remember the smell of his mother's kitchen, the sound of rain on the roof, the neighbour's dog, the road outside, and only later understand that the roof had always depended on a company superintendent's approval. There is a sadness in that, because people made real lives in places designed to keep them temporary. Sanitation was often poor. Water could be unreliable or contaminated. Waste disposal in crowded camps was a constant problem. Disease moved easily through families living close together. When sickness came, the company doctor might be the only available medical care, and his pay could be deducted from wages whether the family used him or not. The arrangement may have looked, on paper, like a benefit. In practice, it was another way the company entered the private life of the worker. A doctor tied to the company occupied an uneasy position. He might be skilled, kind, overworked, and genuinely necessary. But he still belonged to the same system as the payroll office and the store ledger. Even illness did not fully remove a family from company arithmetic. Religion and community softened life without freeing it. Churches mattered. Singing mattered. Funerals mattered. Baseball teams, fraternal organizations, ethnic societies, family visits, garden patches, porch talk, and Saturday gatherings all made the camps more than places of suffering. This is important because if we describe coal camps only as prisons, we miss the human fullness of them. People fell in love there. Babies were born there. Women laughed together there. Men played music, told jokes, argued politics, hunted, drank, prayed, and tried to make something decent inside an arrangement that was not built for their freedom. Oppression does not erase ordinary life. It settles over it, shaping it, limiting it, taxing it. People still live. That is one of the reasons the coalfields produce such strong loyalty and such deep anger at the same time. The miners were not fighting for an imaginary place. They were fighting over the real places where their children slept. Still, beneath that ordinary life was the constant presence of power. The superintendent was not simply a manager. In some camps, he functioned almost like a local ruler. A worker's conduct, his union sympathies, his debts, his willingness to accept conditions, all could affect whether he stayed employed and housed. The mine guard was the visible edge of that authority. Sometimes he watched the road. Sometimes he stood near the store. Sometimes he escorted evicted families out of company houses. Sometimes he carried a gun in a place where the meaning of the gun did not need to be explained. The guard's job was not merely to prevent theft or keep order in the neutral sense. Very often his job was to protect company control from union organisers, strikers, and any miner who thought the camp might belong morally to the people who lived there. There were union men in these places, and they had to move carefully. An organiser might arrive quietly, speaking to miners after dark, in a home with curtains drawn, in a clearing, along a road, anywhere that felt safe for a few minutes. The United Mine Workers of America offered something the company towns did not. The possibility that a miner could bargain as part of a group instead of pleading as one man alone. That was the heart of the matter. A single miner could be fired. A single family could be evicted. A single complaint could disappear into the office. But a union threatened to change the scale of the conversation. It said that wages, safety, hours, and dignity were not favours granted by the company, but matters workers could demand together. To mine operators who had built their profits on control, this was not simply annoying. It was dangerous. The fear of unionisation explains the harshness of the response. Coal companies did not spend money on guards, detectives, spies, and armed force because they believed unions were harmless. They understood very well what collective power could do. If miners in the non-union southern coalfields organised successfully, the balance between labour and capital could shift across the region. Wages might rise, store abuses might be challenged, evictions might become harder, company towns might begin to loosen. The men who owned the mines were not defending only profits from one month to the next. They were defending a whole way of ruling. For the miner, the union question could be terrifying. Joining might mean hope, but it could also mean losing everything before hope arrived. A man had to ask himself what courage was worth if his children were standing beside the road, with furniture piled in the mud. His wife had to live with that question too, though history often leaves her standing quietly behind him, as if she were only a witness. She was not. The wives of miners carried the consequences of labour conflict in their kitchens, their washtubs, their gardens, their sick rooms, and their children's empty stomachs. When a strike came, women stretched food, organised relief, confronted guards, moved between households, and helped hold communities together. The company may have hired men to dig coal, but it was entire families that lived under coal power. By the late 1910s and early 1920s, After years of conflict in West Virginia's coal fields, many miners had come to believe that the company town was not merely unfair but un-American in the plainest sense. That may sound strange because the companies like to present themselves as engines of progress, builders of industry, providers of jobs, but the miners knew another language of America too. They knew the language of freedom, citizenship, speech, home, and the right of a man to stand up right before another man. Many of them had been told that the United States was different from the old countries, different from monarchy, different from landlord rule, different from inherited power. Yet in the coal camps, a worker could feel that one private company had more authority over his daily life than any king. The contradiction was not subtle. Men who had fought in France during the First World War came home to mine guards and company towns, and some of them began asking what exactly they had defended overseas if they could not hold a union meeting at home. This is where resentment deepened into something closer to political consciousness. The miners were not only angry about low pay, they were angry about being governed without consent in the places where they lived. They were angry that local officials could be influenced or controlled by coal interests. They were angry that private armed men could act with the confidence of law. They were angry that courts and sheriffs and governors seemed again and again to understand the fear of property owners more quickly than the fear of working families. And when people lose faith that ordinary channels will hear them, they begin looking for extraordinary ones. No one should imagine that every miner saw the situation in the same way. Some were cautious, some feared unions, some depended on company favour, some disliked the violence that labour conflict brought. Some had ambitions to rise within the system rather than overturn it. Coal camps were not filled with identical men thinking identical thoughts. They were communities full of disagreements, grudges, loyalties, private calculations, and survival instincts. But the pressure inside the system was real, and pressure has a way of finding the cracks. A miner who would not speak openly at the store might speak in his kitchen. A man who avoided a union meeting one month might attend the next after a friend was fired or a neighbour evicted. A wife who feared the risk might become the one urging her husband not to bend after watching the company take too much. Opinion did not move all at once. It moved household by household. The coal camps also created a strange intimacy between the powerless and the powerful. A distant industrialist in a city might never see the miner, but the local representatives of coal power were close. The superintendent could be seen, the guard could be named, the store clerk could be recognised. The house assigned to one family and denied to another stood in plain view. That closeness made resentment personal. The system was large, but it had faces. And when men eventually marched, they were not marching against an abstract economic theory. They were marching against the people and arrangements that had entered their lives at every level. By the time the road to Blair Mountain opened in front of them, the miners carried more than rifles. They carried store accounts, roof falls, funerals, evictions, blacklists, bad air, undercounted coal, insult, hunger, and the memory of being told over and over that the world they lived in was the natural order of things. The company town had taught them what power looked like when it did not have to explain itself. It looked like a rent notice. It looked like a guard at the road. It looked like scrip in a man's hand instead of money he could freely spend. It looked like a family staying quiet because the walls around them belonged to someone else. The remarkable thing is not that men eventually marched. The remarkable thing is how long so many tried not to. They worked. They endured. They borrowed. They hoped for better bosses, better prices, better luck, better seams, better months. They made homes in rented houses and communities in controlled towns. They raised children under the shadow of tipples and tracks. They buried the dead and went back underground because the living still needed food. And through all of it, the company town remained, always asking for more than a day's labour, always reaching into the evening, the kitchen, the account book, the future. That is where the war was prepared, quietly, day after day, long before it had a name. And as we move closer now to the open violence, we have to look more carefully at the tools that held that world in place. Not just the mine itself, not just poverty in the general sense. but the specific instruments of control that miners came to hate most. The private guards who watched them, the company money that trapped them, the store that took back their wages, and the price a man could pay for speaking one sentence too loudly in a town where the company heard almost everything. The company town did not hold miners in place with one single chain. It held them with many small ones, each one ordinary enough to be explained away by the men who benefited from it. Rent was just rent. Store credit was just store credit. A guard was just protection. A contract was just business. A deduction from pay was just an accounting matter. A man told to leave his house after joining the union was just a former employee no longer entitled to company property. That was how the system defended itself. It broke power into pieces so that each piece could be made to look reasonable. But if you were the miner living under all of those pieces at once, if your wages, house, food, doctor, school, road, and safety all ran through the same company office, then the pieces joined together into something much harder to excuse. They became a way of owning a man without admitting that ownership was the point. Let us begin with the mine guard, because he was the part of the system a miner could see standing in front of him. He was not hidden in a ledger. He was not an invisible deduction from wages. He wore a coat, carried a gun, watched the road, stood near the mine entrance, rode with other armed men, and understood that his presence changed the way people spoke. In some places he might be called a guard, a detective, a deputy, a special officer, or simply one of the company men. The title mattered less than the function. He was there to protect the company's property, but in the coal fields, company property included almost everything around the miner. The tracks, the tipple, the houses, the store, the mine mouth, the road into the camp, the peace of the superintendent and the silence of the workers all seemed to fall under the same wide definition. A mine guard did not have to fire his gun to do his work. Most power does not need to be used every day to remain effective. It only has to be visible. A guard standing by the road while men came off shift could make a conversation die before it began. A guard near the company store could remind a woman not to say too much while buying flour on credit. A guard riding through a camp at night could turn a union meeting into a whispered risk. The gun on his hip or in his hands said what the company did not always put into words. This town has owners. This mine has owners. This house has owners. And if you forget that, someone has been hired to remind you. The most feared of these hired forces in West Virginia's mine wars was the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency. The name sounds almost polite if you hear it without context, as if it belonged on a small brass office sign in a city building, the kind of place where men in suits looked into insurance fraud or missing jewellery. But in the coal fields, Baldwin Felts meant something much rougher. Its agents worked for coal operators as private armed men, strike breakers, guards, and enforcers. They arrived when mine owners wanted union activity stopped, families removed, organisers intimidated, or strikers pushed back. To the companies, they were necessary protectors of order. To many miners, they were the physical form of coal power, hired muscle wearing the face of law. This distinction between private force and public law was one of the most dangerous confusions in the coal fields. A sheriff was a public official, at least in theory. A deputy carried the authority of the county. But when mine guards were deputized, or when private detectives worked closely with local officials, or when a sheriff's political life depended on coal interests, the miner could no longer tell where the company ended and the government began. That uncertainty was not a small legal detail. It shaped whether a working man believed he had rights at all. If he complained to the law and found the company waiting for him there too, then the courthouse became just another room in the company town, larger and more formal perhaps, but not truly separate. Now imagine a union organiser entering a non-union coal camp under those conditions. He does not arrive with a parade. He does not stand in the middle of the road and announce himself with a speech. If he is wise, he moves carefully. He speaks to one man, then another. He asks who can be trusted. He listens for which houses are watched, which families are desperate, which men have already been threatened, which guard drinks too much, which clerk repeats everything to the superintendent. A meeting may happen after dark, in a kitchen with curtains drawn, or in the woods beyond the edge of the camp, or in a church if the minister is sympathetic and willing to take the risk. Men come separately so a crowd does not form too obviously. Someone watches the road, someone keeps his voice low. A miner who has spent the day underground now has to decide whether he has enough strength left to risk his job for a future he may never see. And the risk was real. A man who signed a union card could be fired. If he was fired, he could be evicted. If he was evicted, his wife and children were evicted with him. Furniture could be carried outside. Beds, chairs, cooking pots, family trunks, quilts, photographs, everything that made a house feel like a private world could be put into the road under the eyes of the neighbours who knew the same thing could happen to them. There are few punishments more public than eviction in a company town. It did not just remove a family from shelter, it taught everyone watching what disobedience cost. The companies understood that lesson well. They knew that poverty was most effective as a warning when it could be displayed. A fired miner might be replaced. A blacklisted miner might disappear into another county. But an evicted family sitting beside its belongings in the mud became a message. The message was not complicated. This is what happens when you forget who owns the house. And because the houses were lined along roads and tracks where everyone passed, the message did not need a newspaper. It spread through the camp by sight alone. This was one reason tent colonies became such important places in the mine wars. When miners were evicted from company housing during strikes, unions and supporters sometimes helped create tent camps, where families could live outside company property. These places were hard, exposed, crowded, and often miserable, but they were also meaningful because they represented a refusal to disappear. A family in a tent had lost the company house, but it had not necessarily lost the fight. That mattered. A tent could become a symbol of defiance simply because it stood where the company wished there would be nothing. Still, a tent offered thin protection against rain, cold, hunger, and bullets. The people who moved into them knew that independence could be as frightening as dependence when armed men still controlled the roads around you. The mine guards did not only watch union men, they watched information, they watched visitors, they watched newspapers and pamphlets when they could. They watched who lingered after church, who walked together, who received mail, who seemed too confident after a meeting in another town. Surveillance in the coalfields did not require modern technology. It required proximity, fear, and neighbours who knew that repeating a sentence to the right person could earn favour or avoid suspicion. A company town was small enough for privacy to become difficult. A miner could not always know who was listening. A wife could not always know which casual comment at the store would travel upward. Children, because children hear everything, might repeat words they did not understand. The camp made silence practical. This is the part of oppression that often gets missed when history focuses only on open violence. The gunfight is easiest to describe. The dead can be counted. The burned house or broken window can be photographed. But the daily narrowing of speech leaves fewer records. How do you measure the number of sentences a man swallowed? How do you count the meetings that never happened because someone feared the guard outside? How do you put into a report the way a woman lowered her voice when talking about the store account, or the way men changed the subject when a superintendent's clerk entered the room? The price of speaking up was not only what happened after speech, it was the habit of not speaking at all. Now let us turn to scrip, because company money was quieter than a rifle, and in some ways just as powerful. Scrip was not always identical from one camp to another. It could be paper, metal tokens, coupon books, or other forms of private credit issued by a company to workers. But the principle was simple. Instead of receiving wages entirely in United States currency that could be spent anywhere, miners might receive a form of payment useful mainly at the company store or within the company's controlled economy. To an owner or manager, This could be described as convenience. The camp was isolated. Workers needed goods. The store extended credit. Scrip helped keep commerce moving. That was the clean explanation. The lived explanation was different. Scrip meant the company could pay a man and then immediately pull his wages back through the store. It meant the workers' money did not really travel into the wider world. It circled inside the company's territory. If prices at the company store were high, the miner had little choice. If the flour was poor quality, he still needed flour. If shoes for the children cost more than they would in town, the children still needed shoes. If the family was already in debt, the next month's wages might arrive already wounded. A man could work steadily and still feel as if he were walking in place. The harder he moved, the more the ground moved under him. There is a simple frustration in that which deserves to be felt plainly. Imagine working in one of the most dangerous jobs in the country and being handed money that was not fully free. Imagine risking your back, lungs, fingers, eyes, and life underground, then being told that the value of that risk returned to you in a form designed to be spent at the same counter, owned by the same people. It was not slavery. The distinction matters. Miners were wage workers, and many did move between camps over time. But it was also not the free labour market celebrated in speeches and newspapers. Freedom means less when every exit has a price, and every price is set by the people you are trying to leave. The store ledger deepened the trap. Credit could be necessary, especially when work was irregular, when illness came, when a strike cut off wages, when a child needed medicine, when winter required more food and fuel than the last pay allowed. The company store could let a family take goods now and pay later. That sounds helpful until later arrives, and the balance has grown. Debt has a way of changing the meaning of work. A man no longer works only for wages. He works to reduce what he owes, but if the wages are too low, the price is too high, the deductions too many, and the emergencies too frequent, the debt becomes a wall he pushes against without moving it. The company can then point to the ledger and say the worker owes money, as if the ledger itself were neutral, as if the entire system had not been built to make owing likely. A miner's wife often knew the ledger better than anyone. She knew how much flour was left. She knew when the children's shoes were too worn to last another month. She knew which neighbour might lend coffee, and which neighbour was already short. She knew whether a bill could be delayed, whether a meal could be stretched, whether a shirt could be patched one more time instead of replaced. The men spoke of wages and unions, but women lived the arithmetic of the camp in intimate detail. A union defeat was not only a political setback, it could be an empty shelf. A firing was not only a labour action, it could be no credit at the store. The company's control entered the home through the pantry. This is why the demand for a union carried so much more meaning than a demand for a few extra cents per ton. It was a demand to break the circle. The miners wanted wages they could trust, scales they could check, stores they did not have to depend on, homes that were not weapons, and the right to speak without being hunted out of the camp. They wanted the ordinary protections that sound modest only to people who already have them. In the coal fields, ordinary protections looked almost revolutionary. The mine guards understood this too, even if they would not have described it that way. Their job was not just to stop violence. Their job was to stop organisation before it could become strong enough to make demands. A strike that had already begun was dangerous. A union that had not yet formed was easier to kill, so the pressure came early. A man seen with an organiser might be warned. A meeting might be broken up. A family might be threatened. A worker might be told there was no place for union men in that camp. A guard did not have to say everything directly. The coalfields had their own language of implication. A look, a visit, a name mentioned in the office, a gun cleaned where people could see it. These could all speak. At times, the violence became open enough that no one could pretend it was only pressure. During earlier conflicts like the Paint Creek and Cabin Creek strikes in 1912 and 1913, miners, guards, and operators had already tested the boundaries of force in West Virginia. Baldwin Felt's guards were brought in. Families were evicted. Armed camps and fortified positions appeared. The conflict included shootings, martial law, arrests, and the kind of fear that settles into a region long after the immediate strike ends. Those events did not vanish from memory. Miners remembered, operators remembered, guards remembered. The state remembered too, though not always in the way workers wished it would. By the time Blair Mountain approached, southern West Virginia was not stumbling innocently into labour war. It had been walking toward it for years. There was also a deeper insult beneath the guards and scrip. It was the insult of being treated as unfit to make decisions about your own life. Coal operators often spoke as if miners needed firm control, as if union organisers were outside agitators, filling simple men with dangerous ideas, as if the company town were a benevolent arrangement misunderstood by radicals. That language appears again and again in the history of labour conflict. Workers are rarely described by their opponents as adults making rational judgments about their conditions. They are called misled, stirred up, ignorant, foreign, criminal, ungrateful. It is convenient vocabulary because it allows the powerful to avoid the possibility that workers understand their situation perfectly well. The miners did understand. They may not have all used the same political language, and they did not all agree on strategy, but they understood the practical facts of their lives. They understood that a man who could not spend his wages freely was not fully free. They understood that a house tied to employment made obedience easier to demand. They understood that a guard paid by the company was not neutral. They understood that an anti-union contract was not just ink on paper, but a weapon pointed at the dinner table. They understood that when the same company controlled work, shelter, credit, and security, speaking up was never only speech. It was a gamble with everything. Let us imagine one miner, not as a famous leader, not as a name carved into a memorial, but as one of the many men history did not preserve clearly. He has worked all week. His hands are cracked. His back hurts in the evening when he sits down, though he's not yet old enough to admit it. He has a wife, perhaps 3 children, perhaps a 4th coming. He owes the store. He suspects the scales have not been fair. He knows of a man in the next camp who was evicted after talking union. He has heard of Baldwin Felt's men arriving somewhere else. He has also heard that union wages are better in organised fields, that men there have some say, that the company cannot do everything it wants when workers stand together. One night, someone he trusts tells him there will be a meeting. Not a public one, not safe enough for that, just men talking. He goes, or he does not. That is the choice. If he does not go, he may keep his place a little longer. He may avoid attention. He may tell himself that a man with children should not invite trouble, and he would not be cowardly for thinking that. Responsibility can look like caution, but if he does go, he may hear something he cannot unhear. He may sit in a room with other men and recognise his own private anger in their faces. He may learn that the feeling he carried alone is shared by dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. That discovery can change a man. A company can handle one angry worker. It is much less comfortable when angry workers begin counting one another. This is why speech was so dangerous. A union begins in language before it begins in paperwork or dues. Someone says, "This is not right." Someone else says, "I thought the same." Someone says, "They cannot evict all of us." Someone asks, "What if they can?" Someone mentions a meeting in another camp. Someone brings up a name. Someone says Mother Jones is coming, or Sid Hatfield stood up to them, or the union men in another county held firm. Words travel. Words test fear. Words turn private suffering into public grievance. And once that happens, the company's task becomes harder. It is not enough to pay low wages. It must prevent workers from describing low wages together. The price of speaking up was not paid only by men with rifles later on. It was paid by the first person in a camp willing to be suspected. It was paid by the woman who fed an organiser at her table. It was paid by the family that allowed a meeting in its house. It was paid by the miner who refused to deny he had signed. It was paid by the neighbour who would not inform. It was paid in lost work, lost housing, broken bodies, jail cells, and fear that followed children to bed. These were not dramatic choices in the way movies like to present courage. They were often quiet, practical, frightened choices made by people who still had to wake up the next morning and find breakfast. The operators had their own fears, and those fears should be understood even if they do not earn much sympathy. They feared losing control of production. They feared union wages spreading through non-union fields. They feared investors losing confidence. They feared that if one camp organised successfully, the next would follow. They feared the collapse of a system that had made coal profitable, precisely because the workers had so little leverage. In their newspapers and public statements, they often framed this fear as concern for order, law, and prosperity. But order for whom? Law serving whom? Prosperity paid for by whose lungs? These were the questions miners carried even when they did not phrase them so neatly. The state of West Virginia stood in the middle but did not feel neutral to many miners. Governors could declare martial law. Courts could issue injunctions. Sheriffs could arrest organisers. Troops could be sent. Sometimes state intervention restrained private violence. Other times it fell hardest on workers. From the miners' view, the pattern seemed clear enough. When companies used armed guards, it was called protection. When miners armed themselves, it was called rebellion. When companies controlled towns, it was business. When workers tried to control their own labour, it was disorder. That double standard did more than anger miners. It taught them that the language of law could be stretched around power like a fitted coat. Still, the coalfields were not in constant open revolt. Most days, people did what people do. They worked, washed, cooked, repaired, borrowed, prayed, argued, sang, and endured. That is important because it shows how much pressure a society can hold before it cracks. The mine guards were there, the scrip was there, the store ledger was there, the threat of eviction was there, but life continued around those things. Children chased one another between houses, men came home tired, women called them into supper, someone played a fiddle, someone planted beans, someone died too young, someone was born. The company system was not a single event. It was the background against which all ordinary moments happened, and then, every so often, the background stepped forward. A guard arrived at door, a family was ordered out, a man was beaten. A union organiser disappeared from a camp. A strike began. A train brought agents into a town where people already knew their reputation. These moments reminded everyone that the peace of the coalfields was conditional. It lasted as long as miners accepted the rules. It lasted as long as the company's authority was not challenged too openly. It lasted as long as speech stayed small. By 1920 in Mingo County, that arrangement was beginning to fail. Union activity was growing. Coal operators were resisting fiercely. Evictions increased. Baldwin Felt's agents appeared. Families pushed out of company houses gathered in tent colonies. The pressure that had long shaped the camps was now becoming visible in the streets, and in one small town the usual scrip was about to go wrong. The guards would arrive expecting to remove families and leave with their authority intact. The miners would watch, angry and tense, expecting another humiliation. But Mattawan was not quite like the company camps. It had a police chief who did not simply bow to the coal operators, a mayor who questioned the papers placed before him, and a main street where private power would meet public resistance face to face. That is where the next turn in the story waits. Not yet on Blair Mountain, not yet with thousands of men moving through the hills, but on a town street where Baldwin Felt's agent stepped off the train, where evicted families stood at the edge of another hard day, where miners watched from windows and doorways, and where the price of speaking up was about to be counted not in lost wages or store debt, but in gunfire. Mattawan was not supposed to become a battlefield. It was a small town in Mingo County, tucked into the steep country near the Tug Fork, where railroad tracks ran close enough to the street that a train could feel less like transportation and more like an interruption of daily life. It had storefronts, wooden buildings, hotel rooms, a station, men coming and going, and the ordinary sounds of a coalfield town trying to live beside an industry that was always larger than itself. If you had walked into Matewan on a quiet morning in 1920, you might not have sensed immediately that this place was about to become one of the most important labour battlegrounds in American memory. You might have seen a town like many others in southern West Virginia, worn by coal, watched by coal, dependent on coal, and yet different in one important way. Matewan was not simply a company camp. It had elected officials. It had its own local authority. And in that little gap between company power and town power, history found just enough room to break open. By the spring of 1920, Mingo County was tense in a way that people could feel before they could explain it. The United Mine Workers were trying to organise miners in the region, and the coal operators were determined to stop them. This was not a polite disagreement over paperwork. This was a struggle over who would control life in the coal fields. If the union gained a foothold, miners could bargain together, challenge the mine guard system, demand better wages, and weaken the company's grip over housing and stores. If the operators crushed the union, the old order would remain where it had always been, in the payroll office, in the company store, in the hands of guards, in the fear that followed workers home. Everyone understood the stakes even if they did not say them plainly. A union card was not just a card, it was a line crossed. The Stone Mountain Coal Company had miners who were sympathetic to the union, and sympathy was enough to mark a man. In company territory, the punishment for union activity often began at the house. If the company owned your home and you were no longer wanted in the mine, you and your family could be removed from the place where your children slept. That is what made the arrival of Baldwin Felts agents so dreaded. They did not come as neighbours. They did not come to talk things over. They came with authority claimed from papers, orders, company backing, and guns. They came to evict families from company houses and remind the camps that the property belonged to the operators, not to the men who had filled it with beds, dishes, photographs, quilts, and children's shoes. On May 19th, 1920, a group of Baldwin Felts detectives arrived in Matewan. They were led by Albert Felts, and among them was his brother Lee. The Felts name carried weight in the coalfields. The agency had already built a reputation as the hired force mine operators turned to when they wanted strikes broken, families removed, and union organising pushed out. Miners did not need a long explanation when Baldwin Felts men stepped off a train. They knew what their presence meant. It meant the company had decided to make its power visible. It meant families might be standing beside their belongings before nightfall. It meant the argument over union rights had moved from whispers and meetings into the street. Try to see the eviction not as a legal action, not as a line in a court record, but as a scene. A family has been living in a company house. It may be small and rough. It may leak in the rain. It may never have felt secure in the way a home should feel secure. But it is still the place where supper is cooked, where the children know which corner is theirs, where a woman has scrubbed the floor, hung what curtains she could, patched what needed patching, and tried to make a life inside walls that never truly belonged to her. Then armed men arrive. Furniture comes out. A bed frame, a trunk, chairs, maybe a stove. Bedding rolled and carried. A child stands close to his mother, watching strangers handle the objects of his life. Neighbours see everything. Some are angry, some are frightened. Some want to help, but know that helping too openly may put their own homes at risk. This is how a company turns private suffering into a public warning. But Matewan was not exactly the place Baldwin Felts expected it to be. The town had a police chief named Sid Hatfield, and by 1920 he had become something rare in the coalfields. A lawman miners believed might stand with them. He was young, only in his 20s, and later memory would make him larger than life, as memory often does with men who die violently and at the right symbolic moment. But before the legend, there was a real person in a real town with a badge and a choice. Sid Hatfield was not the governor, he was not a senator, he did not command the state militia. He was a local police chief in a small coal town. Yet in that moment, his position mattered because he represented the possibility that law did not have to mean company orders carried out by hired guns. Mayor Cabell Testament mattered too. He was older than Hatfield, a local official with authority of his own, and when the Baldwin Felts men operated in and around Matewan, the question became whether their eviction papers and claims of authority would be accepted without challenge. The details of warrants, jurisdiction, and legal right can seem dry when listed after the fact, but in the street that day they were anything but dry. They were the thin paper border between private force and public law. If the Baldwin Felts agents could enter, evict, and depart without resistance, the message would be clear. The company's authority reached into Matewan. If Hatfield and Testament stopped them, another message would travel through the coalfields. The guards could be challenged. That afternoon, after the evictions, the Baldwin Felts men prepared to leave town. The railroad station became the centre of the moment, as stations often do in stories of conflict, because they are places of arrival and escape. Men who had come in with guns and papers now intended to leave by train, but before they could go, Hatfield confronted them. Mayor Testament was there. Miners and townspeople gathered close enough to watch, close enough to understand that something serious was happening, close enough that if gunfire started there would be nowhere safe to stand. This is one of the details that always makes the scene feel so tense. It was not a remote field, it was a town street. Windows, doors, storefronts, bystanders, lawmen, detectives, miners, all pressed into the same narrow space where one movement, one insult, one hand reaching too quickly could change everything. Albert Felts claimed to have a warrant for Hatfield's arrest. Hatfield in turn was trying to arrest the detectives. Testament examined the warrant, and the famous line remembered from that day is that he declared it bogus. Whether spoken exactly as later accounts preserve it or sharpened by retelling, the meaning was clear enough. The mayor was not accepting the paper as legitimate. In a world where coal companies and their agents often depended on the appearance of authority, that refusal was explosive. It did not merely challenge a document. It challenged the right of Baldwin Felts' men to treat Matewan like another company camp. The shooting began almost immediately after the confrontation reached that point. Later accounts would argue over who fired first, as they almost always do after street fights where too many armed men are standing too close together. But once the first shot sounded, the question of who began it became less important to the people trying to survive it. Guns came out. Men fired from the street, from doorways, from windows, from places that turned the town itself into a trap. The noise must have been shocking in that narrow space, not the distant crack of a rifle in the hills, but close shots slamming between buildings, echoing off wood and brick, sending people down, sending others scrambling for cover. A gunfight in a town street is not clean. It is smoke, panic, splintering sound, bodies dropping where people had been standing a second earlier, and the terrible speed with which an argument becomes death. When it was over, 10 men were dead. 7 Baldwin Felts detectives had been killed, including Albert and Lee Felts. On the town side, Mayor Cabell Testament was dead, along with 2 miners. Sid Hatfield survived, and survival turned him instantly into something more than a local police chief. To miners across the region, he became the man who had stood up to Baldwin Felts and lived. That mattered in ways difficult to overstate. For years, the agency had seemed almost untouchable in the coalfields, the armed hand of operators who usually expected workers to bend. At Matewan, Baldwin Felts' men had been stopped in public, in daylight, in front of the town, and many of them had not walked away. To the coal companies, this was murder and rebellion. To the miners, it felt like proof that the guards could bleed. That is the emotional turn Matewan created. Before the gunfight, miners had plenty of anger, but anger often remains trapped inside fear. A man may hate the system and still believe nothing can be done. He may curse the guards in private and lower his eyes in public. He may dream of resisting and still pay the store account, still go to work, still tell his children not to repeat what they hear at home. Mate 1 altered the imagination of the coalfields. It showed, in the bluntest possible way, that company power was not invincible. A local police chief, a mayor, miners and townspeople had confronted the feared detectives, and the detectives had not prevailed. That kind of event does not stay where it happens. It travels by train, by rumour, by newspaper, by men repeating the story after shift, by women describing what they heard at the store, by children listening from the edges of adult conversation. It becomes a kind of fuel. But victory, if anyone dared call it that, came with a terrible cost. Mayor Testaman was dead. Families were grieving. The town was shaken. The companies were furious. The state and national press now had a dramatic event to point to when describing the coalfields as lawless and violent. For miners, Meta 1 was a symbol of resistance. For coal operators, it was evidence that union agitation had turned workers into armed radicals. Both interpretations hardened the conflict. That is what violence often does. It does not settle the argument, it freezes people deeper into their positions. After Meta 1, it became harder for either side to step back without feeling humiliated. The miners had seen Baldwin Felts beaten. The operators had seen their enforcers killed. The next move would not be gentle. Sid Hatfield's fame grew quickly. He was charged in connection with the killings, but many miners treated him as a hero before any court could define him otherwise. He walked through the coalfields as a living answer to a question men had been asking quietly for years. Could anyone stand up to the mine guards? His name became a promise and a provocation. To workers, he was proof that courage could take a public form. To operators, he was dangerous not only because of what he had done, but because of what he represented. A lawman who sided with miners undermined the entire moral structure the companies depended on. They preferred to present themselves as defenders of law against disorder. Hatfield blurred that picture. He suggested that maybe the disorder had been coming from the men with company backing all along. In the months after Meta 1, Union strength in Mingo County grew, but so did repression. The region became more militarized, more suspicious, more ready for the next clash. Tent colonies remained part of the landscape. Armed men remained part of daily life. Trials, accusations, arrests and threats kept the conflict alive. The coalfields did not return to normal because normal had already been the problem. Meta 1 had simply torn the cover off. It revealed what had been true beneath the surface. The struggle over unionization in southern West Virginia was not a matter that could be contained by a few meetings or legal notices. It involved private armies, local law, state power, poverty, property, and the question of whether working people had any practical right to organize against the men who controlled their homes. It is worth pausing with the people of Meta 1 after the shooting stopped, because the aftermath of violence is often quieter than the event but harder to carry. A town after gunfire does not become normal when the bodies are removed. The street remembers, windows remember, families remember where someone fell. People replay the sound in their heads. They ask who fired first, who ran, who stood, who died quickly, who suffered, who might have lived if one choice had been different. Children hear adults lowering their voices. Women wash blood from clothing or floors. Men who are brave in the moment may tremble later when no one is watching. And above all of it sits the knowledge that powerful people will respond. Meta 1 was not the end of fear. It was the beginning of a new kind. For the Baldwin Felts Agency, the loss was severe and personal. Albert and Lee Felts were not nameless agents. They were important men within the agency, connected to its leadership and reputation. Their deaths demanded revenge in the emotional world of the Coal Wars, whether or not revenge was the word used in public. The agency could not simply absorb the humiliation and move on. The operators could not allow miners to believe Matawan had settled the matter in their favour. The state could not ignore the fact that a small town had hosted a deadly battle between local forces and hired detectives. Every institution around the coalfields now had reason to act, and almost none had reason to trust the others. The miners understood that too. Their celebration of Hatfield was not naive. They knew the companies would strike back. They knew a man who embarrassed Baldwin Felts would not be forgotten, but people need heroes most when the danger is obvious. Hatfield's survival gave miners a name to rally around, and names matter. A movement made only of grievances can become heavy and tired. A movement with a living symbol can walk farther than it thought it could. Sid Hatfield became a kind of coalfield legend while still alive, and legends are useful and dangerous for the same reason. They make men braver. Still, it would be a mistake to imagine that Hatfield alone caused what came next. He did not create the company town. He did not invent scrip, mine guards, evictions, bad wages, dangerous seams, or the operators' resistance to unionisation. He became important because he stood at the point where all those pressures met. Matawan mattered because it gave a dramatic shape to a conflict that had already been building in thousands of ordinary lives. If Hatfield had never existed, the coalfields would still have been angry. But because he did exist, because he stood in that street, because the Baldwin Felts men died and he did not, the anger had a face. The gunfight also changed how the outside world looked at Mingo County. Outsiders often misunderstand places in crisis, because they arrive only after the crisis has become loud enough to report. They see the gunfight, but not the years of pressure before it. They see armed miners, but not evicted families. They see dead detectives, but not the company towns that made private detectives powerful in the first place. After Matawan, newspapers could write about violence in the coalfields as if violence had suddenly erupted from the miners themselves. But anyone who had lived in those hollows knew the eruption had been long prepared. The street fight was not the first act. It was the moment the hidden war became impossible to deny. For a while, Sid Hatfield remained alive inside that impossible attention. He married Testaman's widow, a fact that added another layer of gossip, resentment, and myth around him. He faced legal trouble. He was watched by enemies. He moved through a world where his own fame increased the danger around him. To the miners, he remained a hero. To the coal interests and Baldwin Felts men, he remained unfinished business. That phrase may sound dramatic, but in the coalfields of 1920 and 1921, unfinished business often carried a gun. And then came the courthouse steps in Welch, West Virginia. On August 1st, 1921, more than a year after Matawan, Sid Hatfield travelled to McDowell County to face charges related to another coalfield conflict. He went with his friend Ed Chambers, and their wives were with them. They were not in a mountain ambush. They were not sneaking through a camp at night. They were approaching a courthouse, the very place where law is supposed to replace private revenge. Baldwin Felts' agents were waiting. Hatfield and Chambers were shot down outside the courthouse. Chambers was shot again as he lay helpless. Their wives witnessed the killing. Think about what that meant to the miners who heard the news. The man who had stood up to Baldwin Felts had been killed not in battle, not in a fair fight, but on courthouse steps. That murder tore through the coalfields like a match through dry grass. If Matawan had proved that resistance was possible, the killing of Hatfield and Chambers seemed to prove that the system would never forgive resistance. It told miners that even a lawman could be killed when he became too dangerous to coal power. It told them that the courthouse itself might not protect a man. It turned grief into fury, and fury into motion. Men who had been angry became ready. Men who had been cautious began to listen differently. The old question returned in a sharper form. If the courts could not protect them, if local law could be bought or bypassed, if private detectives could kill a miner's hero in public, then what was left? This is the road from Matawan to Blair Mountain. It is not a straight road on a map, though men would soon walk real roads with rifles in their hands. It is a road made of accumulated conclusions. The conclusion that the company town would not reform itself. The conclusion that mine guards would not disappear because miners asked politely. The conclusion that union rights would not be granted simply because they were just. The conclusion that men who controlled coal could call on guards, deputies, courts, governors, and newspapers, while miners had mostly one another. After Hatfield's death, that one another began to matter more than ever. So when the miners gathered later that August, they did not gather out of nowhere. They gathered from grief, memory, rumour, loyalty, anger, and the practical knowledge of men who had seen every ordinary channel fail them. Some came because of Matiwan, some came because of Sid Hatfield, some came because of their own debts and evictions, some came because friends were going and they would not stay behind. Some came because they believed the Union's future in West Virginia depended on opening Mingo County. Some came because they could no longer bear the feeling of being ruled by men who never went underground. They came as workers, veterans, fathers, immigrants, black miners, white miners, mountain men, union men, frightened men, reckless men, tired men. They came with all the confusion and conviction that real people bring to history. Matiwan had turned anger into war not because one gunfight solved anything, but because it revealed the cost of leaving things as they were. The dead in the street, the dead on the courthouse steps, the evicted families, the guarded camps, the union meetings broken by fear, all of it now pointed toward the same ridge. Before long, men would begin tying red bandanas around their necks, not as decoration, not as theatre, but so they could recognise one another in the hills. They would gather near Marmot. They would march south. They would tell themselves they were going to free Mingo, to end the mine guard system, to make the coalfields safe for Union men. And ahead of them, Logan County would prepare for their arrival, with Sheriff Don Chafin raising armed defenders along the ridges, turning the mountains into a barrier. The town of Matiwan stayed behind them, but it did not fade. It walked with them as memory. It walked in the story of Sid Hatfield facing the detectives. It walked in the bitterness of his murder. It walked in the belief that coal power could be challenged, and the knowledge that challenging it could get a man killed. And as the miners began to gather in numbers too large for the companies to dismiss as a few agitators, the conflict changed again. It was no longer only a town street, no longer only a courthouse killing, no longer only the question of one police chief or one agency. It was becoming a march, and a march has a sound of its own. Boots on dirt roads, rifles against shoulders, men calling to one another through the heat, the mountains receiving them, and somewhere beyond the next ridge, armed men waiting to stop them. The men did not gather all at once. That is important to understand. An army in a history book can appear suddenly, as if someone wrote a number on a page and the number became bodies. 10,000 miners, 7,000 miners, 13,000 miners. Different accounts give different estimates, and the exact count matters less than the fact that the gathering became too large for anyone in power to pretend it was only a few troublemakers. But in the beginning, it was not a number. It was one man leaving a house before anyone could talk him out of it. It was another man borrowing a rifle. It was a group walking along a road together because none of them wanted to be the first to arrive alone. It was men coming from Kanawha, Boone, Fayette, Mingo, McDowell, Logan, and the nearby coal country, carrying not only weapons but the anger of whole camps behind them. By late August of 1921, the murder of Sid Hatfield had already travelled through the coalfields in the way bad news travels when people are waiting for it. It moved faster than official statements. It moved faster than calm explanations. A man came home from town and said Sid was dead. A woman heard it at the store and carried it back with the flour. A miner heard it from another miner coming off shift. And for a moment the noise of the mine seemed to fall away around the sentence. Sid Hatfield had been shot on courthouse steps. Ed Chambers, too. Their wives had been there. Baldwin Felt's men were involved. That was enough. Details would come later, and then arguments over details after that. but the emotional fact was immediate. The man who had stood up at Matawan had been killed in the open, at a place that was supposed to belong to the law. For many miners, that changed the shape of the future. Until then, there had always been some argument for waiting. Wait for the union to gain more strength. Wait for the courts. Wait for the governor. Wait for public opinion to notice. Wait because your children need a roof. Wait because a strike can starve a family. Wait because the companies are powerful, and the guards are armed, and the jails are real. Working people are often asked to wait by people who are not living under the pressure that makes waiting so costly. In the coal fields, after Hatfield's death, waiting began to feel less like patience and more like surrender. If a police chief could be killed in public after defying the mine guards, what exactly were ordinary miners supposed to expect for themselves? The gathering point became Marmet, along the Kanawha River, not far from Charleston. It was not a grand place made for history. Most places where history changes are not. They're road junctions, fields, depots, river towns, courthouse steps, little rooms behind stores, camp clearings where people arrived dusty and uncertain. Marmet became the place where men could see their private anger turning public. A miner who had thought of himself as one angry man could arrive and find hundreds already there. Then more again. Men with rifles, men with lunch pails, men in work clothes, men still carrying the marks of the mine on their bodies, men who had fought in the Great War, and men who had never been farther from home than the next county, men with accents from Europe, black miners, white miners from mountain families, immigrant miners who had been promised America and found the company store waiting for them. Men who may not have shared churches, neighborhoods, languages, or the same place in the racial order of America, but who understood the company town, the mine guard, the dangerous seam, and the feeling of being treated as a replaceable body. In a nation built so often around division, that fact frightened the coal operators almost as much as the rifles did. The miners gathering at Marmet were not a perfect brotherhood. No one should imagine that racism, suspicion, ethnic rivalry, and old prejudices disappeared because men tied cloth around their necks. They did not. These were human beings carrying the habits and wounds of the world they lived in. But the coalfields had taught them something practical. Underground, men depended on one another. A warning in time could save a life. A careless man could endanger everyone near him. Dust, gas, stone, and explosion did not respect the neat social lines Americans drew above ground. And when the companies used those lines to keep workers divided, many miners began to understand that division was not accidental. It was useful to the men in charge. The red bandanas mattered because they gave that understanding a visible form. Miners tied red cloth around their necks so they could recognize one another during the march, and in the confusion that might follow. In the woods, on unfamiliar roads, in a crowd where not every face was known, the cloth helped mark friend from enemy. It was practical before it became symbolic, but symbols often begin that way. A thing used because it works becomes a thing remembered because it meant something. A red bandana was cheap, easy to carry, easy to tie, and visible enough to identify a man at distance. It did not make him safe. In fact, it could make him more visible to the people who wanted the march stopped. But it turned the miners into a common sight. One man in work clothes with a rifle could be dismissed as a local problem. Thousands of men with red cloth at their throats became something else. The word redneck would later travel far away from this moment and gather many meanings, some proud, some insulting, some careless. But here, in this stretch of West Virginia history, it carried a specific memory. It pointed to men who marked themselves with red bandanas during a labor uprising. That does not explain every later use of the word, and language has a way of picking up mud as it moves through time. But in the coalfields of 1921, the redneck was not a joke. It was a sign of identification and solidarity. It said, "I am with the miners." It said, in a place where guards and deputies may be watching, I am not pretending to be neutral. That kind of visible commitment is not a small thing when people have been punished for far less. The rifles mattered too, and they made everything more dangerous. A rifle in the hands of a miner could mean many things at once. It could be a hunting tool, something common in mountain households. It could be a weapon brought back from military service. It could be borrowed, old, unreliable, familiar, or terrifyingly efficient depending on the man and the gun. To the miners, being armed meant they would not walk helplessly into a region guarded by men who already had weapons. To the operators and public officials, armed miners looked like insurrection. Both views existed at the same time. This is one of the hard truths of the march. The miners were not merely peaceful petitioners, and they were not simply criminals either. They were workers who had concluded that unarmed protest might be crushed before it was heard, and armed protest might bring down the full power of the state. Neither path was safe. Some of the men who gathered had worn an army uniform only a few years earlier. The First World War had ended in 1918, close enough that memories of trenches, gas masks, orders, rifles and military discipline were still fresh. These veterans had been told that they were fighting for democracy, civilization, and the rights of free people. Then they returned to coal camps where private guards could help decide whether their families remained housed, where union meetings could be treated like crimes, where company power seemed to reach into every corner of daily life. That contradiction did not sit quietly in every man. A veteran knew what it meant to march, to take orders, to move with others, to sleep badly, to carry fear without admitting it too often. He also knew that governments could ask poor men to fight for large words. In 1921, some of those men began applying the large words at home. The leadership around the march was uneasy. Frank Keeney and Fred Mooney, leaders of United Mine Workers District 17, had been central figures in the struggle, but controlling a movement of armed, angry men was different from calling a meeting or issuing a demand. Bill Blizzard, young and forceful, became one of the important figures associated with the miners as they moved toward Logan County. But even here, it is important not to turn the march into a simple story of commanders and soldiers. This was not the regular army. This was not a clean chain of command with uniform, supply lines, and one unquestioned authority. It was a mass of workers trying to become organized enough to move and angry enough not to turn back. Leadership existed, but it had to ride the energy of the men more than command it completely. There were attempts to stop the march before it began in earnest. Governor Ephraim Morgan understood that if thousands of armed miners moved south, the result could be bloodshed on a scale the state might not control. He wanted help from the federal government and wanted the miners dispersed. Even some people sympathetic to the miners feared what would happen if they tried to force their way into Logan and Mingo counties. One of the most complicated figures in this moment was Mother Jones. For decades she had been a fierce labour organiser, one of the most famous voices working people had, especially miners. Men who had heard her speak remembered the force of her, the way she could turn a crowd's exhaustion into anger and a crowd's anger into courage. She had stood with workers in bitter strikes and had no record of being tender toward mine owners. But at Marmot, faced with the prospect of miners marching into prepared defences, she urged them not to go. It is worth treating that moment carefully. It is easy, from a distance, to accuse or defend too quickly. Mother Jones was old by then, older than most people in that crowd would ever become. She'd seen labour violence before. She knew that the miners were walking toward men with better positions, better backing, and a government that might not hesitate to intervene. She feared a slaughter. According to National Park Service accounts, on August 24th she came to Marmot and read what she claimed was a telegram from President Warren Harding, telling the miners to return home and promising action against mine guards if they dispersed. Several men doubted it. Frank Keeney challenged her. The telegram was denounced as fake. The relationship between Jones and some of the miners was damaged in that moment, in a way that would not easily heal. Try to imagine how it felt from the crowd. Many of these men admired Mother Jones. Some may have thought of her almost as a living piece of the labour movement, someone who had suffered and fought with them across years. Then she stood before them and told them to go home. Maybe some wanted desperately to believe her. Going home meant sleeping in a familiar bed, seeing children again, avoiding the ridge ahead. Going home meant staying alive. But going home also meant returning to the same company towns, the same mine guards, the same martial law in Mingo, the same dead Sid Hatfield, the same lesson repeated again. Wait, endure, accept. If the telegram was false, then the old woman who had once told miners to fight had now become part of the effort to stop them. That was how many heard it. Whether fair or not, the disappointment cut deep because it came from someone they had trusted. The march began anyway. That may be the simplest sentence in this entire story, and one of the heaviest. The march began anyway. Not because everyone agreed, not because the path was clear, not because victory was likely, not because every man understood the politics or the risks in the same way. It began because too many men had reached the point where turning back felt impossible. They were going toward Logan County because Logan stood between them and Mingo had become the symbol of everything they wanted to break open: martial law, jailed miners, anti-union repression, the mine guard system, the closed coal fields. They did not describe all of it in the same language, but the direction was clear enough. South. The road south was not a parade. It was hot, crowded, uncertain and full of rumour. Men carried rifles, ammunition, food when they had it, blankets or bedrolls if they could manage, and whatever private fears they did not want to show. The mountains shaped every mile. Roads twisted through valleys. Creeks ran beside them. Ridges rose thick with trees. A man could look ahead and see only the next bend, which is a difficult way to march into danger. The land did not open itself easily. It forced the men into columns, slowed them, hid them from one another, and made every report from ahead feel both urgent and doubtful. Someone heard Chaffin had thousands waiting. Someone heard federal troops were coming. Someone heard miners had been attacked. Someone heard a train could be taken. Someone heard the march had been called off. Rumour moved as constantly as the men did. At one point, miners commandeered trains, including one that became known as the Blue Steel Special, using the rail system of coal country to move men toward the fight. There is a strange justice in that image, though it was also a dangerous escalation. Railroads existed in the coal fields mainly to carry coal out and company power in. Now miners were using trains to carry themselves. Men crowded into cars and onto platforms, armed and dusty, joking, shouting, arguing, singing perhaps, though not because the journey was light-hearted. People sing in hard moments because silence can become too heavy. The train moved through country shaped by the industry they served, past coal tipples, sidings, small towns, and the same tracks that had carried the wealth of their labour away from them for years. Food and supply became practical problems almost immediately. An armed march may begin with anger, but it continues on bread, water, ammunition and coordination. Men had to eat. Men had to sleep somewhere. Messages had to move. Groups had to stay connected. Leaders had to decide whether to continue, turn back, wait, or shift direction based on reports that might be wrong by the time they arrived. This is where the romance of uprising, if anyone still feels it, runs into the reality of tired feet and empty stomachs. A miner could be brave and still hungry. He could believe in the cause and still wonder whether his children were frightened at home. He could carry a rifle and still have no clear idea what would happen if he had to fire it at another American. Back home, families waited in the camps and towns the miners had left behind. This part of the march is quieter, but it matters. The men were visible on the road. The women were visible in the consequences. A wife whose husband joined the march had to continue the work of the household while not knowing whether he would return, whether his name would be recorded, whether the company would retaliate, whether wages would stop, whether guards would come, whether neighbours would help if things turned bad. She had to answer children's questions without having real answers. She had to listen for news and judge which rumour to trust. Every public movement creates private waiting rooms, and in the coalfields those rooms were kitchens, porches, tent colonies, company houses, and store counters where ordinary errands carried the weight of war. As the miners moved south, Sheriff Don Chaffin prepared Logan County. Chaffin was already notorious among Union miners, a county boss and lawman tied to coal interests, and he understood that if the marchers crossed Logan and reached Mingo, the symbolic defeat for anti-Union power would be enormous. He gathered deputies, volunteers, mine guards, and supporters. He fortified positions along Blair Mountain and nearby passes. The defenders had the high ground, better organisation in certain places, and the advantage of waiting behind prepared lines. The miners had numbers and anger, but numbers are not everything in mountain fighting. A ridge can make a small force stronger. Trees can hide a gunman. A narrow approach can slow a crowd. The land itself was becoming part of Chaffin's defence. The miners knew Chaffin's reputation. They knew Logan County was not friendly ground. That knowledge did not calm them. It gave the march a sharper edge. Men were not walking into a neutral county hoping to persuade officials over coffee. They were heading toward an armed barrier assembled to stop them. Some believed that enough miners could overwhelm it. Some believed Chaffin's men would not stand if faced with thousands. Some believed federal troops might intervene before a major battle. Some may have believed nothing clearly at all and simply kept pace with the men beside them. In large movements, certainty is often unevenly distributed. A few men speak confidently. Many men follow, partly because turning around alone would feel worse. There were moments when the march seemed as if it might dissolve. Negotiations, warnings, rumours of presidential intervention, pressure from union leaders, and the obvious danger of the situation all pulled at the miners. Some did turn back at points, some hesitated. The crowd was not a machine. It breathed, swelled, thinned, paused, argued, and surged again. That is important because it makes the decision to continue more human. These were not men under a spell. They were men making and remaking a dangerous choice hour by hour as conditions changed around them. Every mile south was another chance to stop. Every mile south also made stopping harder because men had already risked being seen, named, and remembered. The red bandanas became more than identification as the march continued. They became proof that the miners had accepted a shared danger. A man could remove one, of course. Cloth can be untied. But in a crowd with others watching, that act would mean something too. So the bandana stayed. Around necks, under collars, sometimes damp with sweat, sometimes bright against dark work clothes, the red cloth turned separate men into a visible force. Reporters would notice it. Enemies would notice it. Later generations would return to it. But for the miners in those days, it was immediate and practical. It helped them know who was with them when the hills became confusing, and the shooting, once it started, would make confusion worse. What did they think victory would look like? That depends on which miner you ask, and most of them left no written answer. Some likely imagined marching into Mingo and freeing jailed miners. Some imagined driving out mine guards. Some imagined forcing recognition of the Union. Some imagined revenge for Hatfield. Some imagined simply showing the companies that miners could no longer be treated as isolated men. The goals overlapped, but they were not always identical. That lack of one clean objective would matter later, but in the gathering phase it may have helped more than it hurt. Different grievances could all point in the same direction. A man did not have to agree with every speech to know he hated the mine guard system. He did not have to understand every legal demand to know he wanted Mingo opened. He did not have to think of himself as a revolutionary to believe something in the coalfields had to give. The outside world watched with growing alarm. To many officials and newspapers, thousands of armed workers moving through West Virginia looked like a breakdown of order. There were fears of insurrection, class war, radicalism, and a challenge to state authority. Some of those fears were exaggerated, some were not. Armed men were moving toward armed men, people were likely to die, but again, the language of order deserves careful handling. The coal camps had long been ordered in a way that benefited the operators. Mine guards had long enforced a kind of private order. Families had long been evicted in the name of property. Miners had long been told to obey systems they had little voice in shaping. When that order produced an armed march, officials treated the march as the beginning of disorder. The miners understood it as the result. By the time the columns neared the approaches to Logan County, the march had become something larger than its leaders. It had acquired its own momentum. Men had slept badly, eaten poorly, sweated through their clothes, listened to rumours, argued over what Mother Jones had done, cursed Chafin, remembered Hatfield, checked their rifles, and kept moving. The road had turned them from angry workers into a visible army, though not an army in the formal sense. They were still miners, still fathers and husbands and sons, still men with debts and injuries and private doubts. But together, moving south, they forced the state and the nation to confront them. Ahead, Blair Mountain waited. Not as a symbol yet, not as a phrase in a textbook, but as a real barrier of trees, ridges, rough ground, and armed defenders. The miners were approaching a place where numbers would meet position, where anger would meet machine guns, where men who had survived the dark underground would have to crawl through brush under fire in daylight. Behind them were the camps that had made them. Around their necks was red cloth. In their hands were rifles. In their minds were the dead of Matewan, the courthouse steps at Welch, the jailed men of Mingo, the evicted families, the company store, and the old warning that if they spoke too loudly, everything could be taken from them. They had spoken now in the loudest way they knew how. The mountains had heard them coming, and as the first shots came closer, as Chaffin's defenders waited along the ridges, and the miners pushed toward the passes, the march began to change into battle. The long road south narrowed into woods, ravines, and hidden positions. The men who had tied bandanas so they could recognize one another would soon need them in a place where smoke, leaves, fear, and gunfire made recognition difficult. The question was no longer whether the miners would gather. They had gathered. It was no longer whether they would march. They had marched. The question waiting on Blair Mountain was what America would do when its working men came armed to demand the freedom they believed had been denied them. By the time the miners reached the approaches to Blair Mountain, the march had stopped feeling like a march and started feeling like a crossing into another country. Not because they had left the United States. That was part of the terrible strangeness of it. They were still in America, still in West Virginia, still in the same mountains where coal smoke hung over towns and company houses leaned against the hills. But the world ahead of them had changed. The road no longer felt like a road ordinary men used to reach work, church, a store, a cousin's house, or a county seat. It had become a line between two ideas of the country. On one side were the miners, many of them poor, armed, tired, and convinced that the law had failed them. On the other side were deputies, mine guards, volunteers, county forces, and men gathered under Sheriff Don Chaffin, determined to stop them before they could pass through Logan County and reach the non-union fields beyond. Between them stood Blair Mountain, thick with trees, steep with ridges, and quiet in that uneasy way land can be quiet just before men begin firing into it. Blair Mountain was not a battlefield made for neat lines. There were no broad, open fields where both sides could see the shape of the fight. There were no tidy formations, no polished cavalry charges, no flags moving gracefully over grass. This was mountain fighting. The trees broke sight lines. The ridges lifted some men above others. Ravines and hollows hid movement. A rifle crack could come from a place no one could immediately locate. A man could fire at smoke, at leaves, at a sound, at a flicker of movement that might be an enemy or might be nothing. The land made certainty difficult. and that difficulty mattered. The miners had numbers, but numbers are less impressive when they have to move uphill through forest toward men already waiting in prepared positions. Chafin's defenders had the high ground, better organisation in places, and machine guns positioned where they could command approaches. The miners had anger, rifles, courage, and confusion. The mountain accepted all of it without taking sides. Try to imagine a miner stepping off the road and into that wooded ground. He has spent much of his life going down into the earth. He knows darkness, pressure, the smell of coal, the weight of stone above his head. Now he is above ground, surrounded by green leaves, summer heat, insects, and the sharp awareness that death can come from somewhere he cannot see. He may be a veteran and know the sound of gunfire too well. He may be a hunter and know how to move through woods quietly. He may be a young man who has never fired at another human being in his life. Around his neck is the red bandana that told others he was with the miners. In his hands is a rifle. Behind him are the company towns, the evictions, the mine guards, the store debts, the dead of Matewan, the courthouse steps at Welch, the funeral anger of Sid Hatfield's name. Ahead of him is a ridge held by men who have been told that he's a threat to order, property, and the peace of Logan County. The first shots around the approaches to Logan County did not instantly become one continuous roar. Fighting in terrain like that often came in bursts, a crack from one ridge, a reply from below, a sudden burst from a machine gun, men dropping flat, someone shouting that the fire was coming from the left, someone else insisting it was from above, then quiet, but not real quiet, the kind of quiet where every leaf sound becomes suspicious, then another shot, then several. The miners moved, stopped, crawled, took cover, pushed forward where they could, and tried to make sense of a battlefield that refused to show itself clearly. The defenders held positions along the ridges and gaps, using the shape of the land as a weapon. Blair Mountain was not merely where the battle happened. It helped decide how the battle could happen. Machine guns changed the emotional texture of the fight. A rifle is frightening, but it still belongs partly to the older world of hunting, home defence, and the individual marksman. A machine gun feels like industry turned sideways against the body. It is mechanical, repetitive, impersonal, and deeply modern in the worst possible sense. These miners worked in the industrial age. They knew what machines could do when placed in service of production. Now they face machines placed in service of stopping them. The same modern America that needed their coal, that wanted its trains moving and factories lit and cities warmed, now met them in the woods with weapons capable of sweeping a hillside. There is a grim symmetry in that. The men who had fed the industrial machine were being told by another machine where they could not go. For Chaffin's defenders, the machine guns were not just weapons, they were confidence. A small number of armed men in fortified positions could hold back a much larger body if the approach was narrow enough and the fire heavy enough. Chaffin understood the mountain. He understood that the miners had to come through certain places if they wanted to cross. He understood that the ridge could turn his force into a wall. In newspaper language, his men were defending Logan County from invasion. In the miners' language, Chaffin's army was protecting the mine guard system and keeping Union men out of territory the coal operators wanted closed. The same ridge looked different depending on which side of it you stood on. There were stories of bullets cutting leaves from trees, of men firing from behind rocks and logs, of miners nearly breaking through in places before being pushed back. Later estimates would speak of enormous numbers of rounds fired, sometimes as many as 1 million, though exact figures in conflicts like this are never as clean as they sound. What matters for the feeling of the thing is the scale. This was not a street corner fight. This was not one sudden exchange like Matewan. This was days of armed confrontation across difficult ground, with thousands of working men facing an organised defensive force backed by local authority and coal money. The mountains heard gunfire not as an accident, but as a sustained argument over who would control the coal fields. And then came the planes. That detail still has the power to stop people cold. Planes. In the mountains of West Virginia in a labour conflict in 1921. We're used to imagining airplanes as part of later wars, later technologies, later kinds of state power. But the First World War had ended only 3 years earlier, and aviation had already begun changing what force could look like. The idea that men on the ground could be watched, threatened, or attacked from the air was still new enough to feel almost unreal, and yet here it was, appearing over a fight between miners and the forces protecting coal operators. Private planes connected to the anti-Union side were used in the conflict, and reports from the period describe homemade bombs being dropped in the battle area. The exact military significance of those bombs was limited compared to the fear they created. But fear is never a minor detail in battle. A bomb does not have to destroy an army to change what men feel when they look up. Imagine being one of those miners in the woods, already trying to understand where the bullets are coming from, and then hearing the engine above. That thin mechanical sound in the sky. You look up through leaves and see a plane passing overhead. Not a bird, not weather, not something belonging to the mountains at all, but a machine from the new century circling over men who still came from houses without much money, from camps where the store ledger mattered more than anything in the clouds. Someone shouts, men scatter or freeze, maybe nothing falls, maybe something does, maybe the object drops and does not explode, maybe it bursts somewhere else with smoke and terror more than military effect. But the message is unmistakable. The forces against the miners were not limited to men in the trees. The sky itself had been brought into the struggle. There is something deeply revealing about that. Coal operators and their allies had spent years insisting that miners needed to obey the law, respect property, and stop being disorderly. Yet when the conflict reached its fiercest point, planes were used in support of the forces stopping workers from reaching the non-union counties. The imbalance was almost absurd. On one side, miners with rifles, some brought from home, some old, some carried by men who had no uniform and no government behind them. On the other side, entrenched defenders, machine guns, private planes, and soon the power of the United States Army. It is hard to hear that and still pretend this was simply a quarrel between two equal sides. At the same time, the miners were not helpless victims standing still under punishment. They fired back. They moved through the woods. They tried to flank positions. They pushed hard enough that defenders genuinely feared breakthroughs. Some miners had enough experience from the war or from hunting and mountain life to make them dangerous opponents. Chafin's men were not facing a crowd of unarmed protesters. They were facing thousands of armed workers who had come too far to be dismissed. That is why the battle became so serious so quickly. Both sides had reason to believe the other could hurt them badly. Both sides had weapons. Both sides believed backing down might mean losing everything that mattered. The federal government watched with growing alarm. President Warren Harding had already warned the miners to disperse, and when they did not, Washington moved toward intervention. To officials far from the hollows and ridges, the scene in West Virginia looked like an insurrection. Thousands of armed men were fighting local forces. State authority seemed unable to settle the conflict. The language of national order came down over the mountains. Federal troops were sent. Army aircraft were involved in surveillance, and the presence of the federal government transformed the meaning of the fight. The miners had been willing to face Chafin's men. They had been willing to face mine guards, deputies, and the armed power of coalfield law. But now the United States Army was coming. That changed everything. Many of the miners were veterans. They knew what the uniform meant. Some had worn it. Some had watched friends die under it. Some had crossed the ocean in it. They could hate the mine guards and still hesitate before firing on federal soldiers. They could believe the government had been unfair and still feel that the army represented something different from Baldwin Felts or Don Chaffin. This hesitation was not weakness. It was a complicated kind of loyalty. These men were angry at America's coal system, angry at the state government, angry at local power, angry at rich men who could hire guards and influence officials. But many still believed, or wanted to believe, that the United States itself was not simply the private army of the coal operators. When federal troops arrived, that belief was tested in the hardest possible way. Think about the emotional violence of that moment. A miner has marched because he believes no one in power will hear him otherwise. He has risked his job, his home, maybe his life. He has faced gunfire from men he sees as agents of coal power. He has been told to go home before and refused. Now soldiers arrive wearing the uniform of the country he may have fought for only a few years earlier. If he keeps fighting, he may have to shoot at the United States Army. If he stops, the march ends before reaching its goal. Either choice wounds something inside him. To continue is to cross a line most men were not willing to cross. To stop is to accept that the full weight of the nation has landed against the miners' advance, whatever words officials use to describe neutrality and order. The miners began to lay down their arms. Some surrendered rifles openly. Others hid weapons in the woods before leaving, unwilling to give up something valuable or fearful of prosecution. Men who had arrived in anger now faced the quiet humiliation of dispersal. Not defeat in the simple battlefield sense, because this was not a clean military campaign, but the collapse of the march's purpose. They would not break through to Mingo. They would not drive out the mine guard system by force. They would not, in that moment, open the southern coalfields to the Union. The mountain had held. The government had intervened. The road south was closed. There is a photograph from the aftermath that captures something words struggle to hold. Miners surrendering rifles to federal troops. It is not an image of theatrical surrender, not the end of a foreign war with generals at table. It is working men handing over weapons in the mountains of their own country. Their clothes are plain. Their faces, depending on the image you see, are hard to read. Maybe tired, maybe angry, maybe relieved to be alive, maybe already thinking of what waits back home. That is what makes the image so powerful. It does not show men who never mattered. It shows men who mattered enough to frighten the nation, and yet not enough for the nation to answer their demands the way they wanted. The casualties at Blair Mountain are difficult to state with certainty. Some deaths were recorded. Others may have disappeared into the confusion of the mountains, rumour or silence. Estimates vary, and that uncertainty itself tells us something about whose lives are carefully counted and whose are allowed to blur. In official language, the battle could be summarised with dates, forces, outcomes, indictments. But for the people there, each death had a name before it became a number. A miner killed on a hillside was not a casualty category. He was someone's husband, son, brother, father, boarder, friend, neighbour. A defender killed in Chaffin's lines was also a human being pulled into a conflict larger than one life. History asks us to hold that without losing sight of the power imbalance that created the fight. Compassion for the dead does not require pretending the system was fair. After the shooting stopped, the mountains did what landscapes always do. They absorbed the silence. The leaves kept moving. The ridges remained. The road still curved through the hills. But the people did not simply return to the day before. Federal troops remained long enough to restore what officials called order. The miners went back into a world where the companies still held enormous power. Many were arrested. Nearly 1,000 miners would eventually face indictments on charges that included murder, conspiracy, and treason against the state of West Virginia. Treason. That word is heavy. It is usually reserved for betrayal of the state itself, for enemies of the nation, for people imagined as outside the circle of loyalty. To apply it to coal miners was to say that their armed resistance had not merely challenged mine owners or county officials, but the political order of West Virginia. The miners had wanted to say that the coal fields were ruled unjustly. The state answered, in part, by saying the miners themselves had become the threat. Some of the trials would not go the way the prosecution hoped. Bill Blizzard, one of the key figures associated with the miners, was tried for treason and acquitted. Other defendants were acquitted as well, and some received prison sentences. But the courtroom aftermath, even when it brought acquittals, drained the movement. Trials cost money, time, energy, and nerve. A miner facing charges cannot easily organise a camp. A union spending resources defending men in court has less strength for building power elsewhere. Legal pressure can do what bullets do not. It can scatter, exhaust, and warn. The immediate result for the United Mine Workers in southern West Virginia was devastating. Organising in the region suffered badly after Blair Mountain. The Union would not gain the kind of lasting strength it wanted in those coalfields until the New Deal era, when federal labour law changed the ground beneath American unions in the 1930s. That means the miners who marched in 1921 did not see the victory they wanted. This matters because we often like our stories of courage to pay off quickly. We want the march to lead to triumph, the sacrifice to open the door, the mountain to be crossed, the workers to win because they deserve to. But history is not obligated to reward people on the schedule that justice would prefer, and yet calling Blair Mountain a simple defeat feels wrong too. The miners did not win their immediate goals. They were stopped. Their union drive was weakened. Many suffered legal consequences, but they also revealed something that could not be easily unseen. They showed the nation that the coalfields were not peaceful company property inhabited by grateful workers. They showed that the system of guards, scrip, evictions, and anti-union repression could produce an armed uprising large enough to require federal troops. They forced America to look, however briefly, at the hidden violence underneath industrial comfort. A country that burned coal in its furnaces and rode behind coal-powered trains had to confront the men who dug it out and ask why so many of them were willing to risk death rather than return quietly to the old arrangement. The memory of the plains remained especially bitter. The idea that aircraft had appeared over American workers in a labour conflict carried a symbolic force far beyond the damage done by any one bomb. It suggested that modern technology, which was often celebrated as progress, could be turned against people asking for basic rights. Machine guns in the hills said the same thing. Federal troops said it in a different language. The full machinery of modern power, private and public, local and national, had converged on men whose original demands were not extravagant. They wanted the right to organise. They wanted to be paid fairly. They wanted mine guards out of their lives. They wanted the company town loosened from around their families. That is what makes the scale of the response feel so haunting. There is a question here that does not fade easily. What does a nation do when the people who fuel it feel they must fight it to be heard? Not metaphorically fight it. Not complain in letters. Not vote in an election and wait for change someday. Fight it with rifles in the woods. Blair Mountain forces that question into view. The miners were not outside America. They were part of its working body. Their labour made other people rich, warm, mobile and powerful. But when they demanded a different arrangement, they were treated as a danger to order. That contradiction sits at the centre of the battle. The country needed them underground. It feared them when they came above ground together. By the time the miners drifted home, hid their rifles, surrendered their weapons, or faced arrest, the Great March had broken apart into individual returns. That must have been one of the loneliest parts of it. It is one thing to move with thousands, to feel history around you like weather. It is another to walk back toward a company camp, knowing the mountain was not crossed. Men who had been part of something enormous now had to become ordinary again. A husband at the door, a father at the table, a miner needing work, a defendant perhaps, a marked man perhaps. The red bandana could be folded away, but what it had meant could not be so easily put back in a drawer. What did their wives see when they came home? Relief first, maybe, if the man was alive. Then the next questions. Are you hurt? Did anyone see you? Are they arresting men? Is the company taking names? Do we have to leave? Will you have work? What happened out there? The story of Blair Mountain did not end on the ridge because the consequences came home with the men. Children would hear fragments. Some would grow up with the battle as family memory. Some would be told not to talk about it. In communities shaped by repression, memory itself can become dangerous. What a family says at the kitchen table may differ from what it says in public. The coalfields learned that lesson well. The official world would move on faster than the people did. Newspapers found other headlines. Politicians turned to other problems. Coal continued to come out of the mountains. Companies continued to operate. The United States did not reorganize itself because miners had fought at Blair Mountain. But underground and in the camps, memory stayed. Men remembered where they had marched. Women remembered waiting. Families remembered evictions, deaths, arrests, and the names of those who had stood with them or against them. The mountain became not only a place but a wound, and wounds can close without disappearing. As the smoke thinned and the troops restored order, Blair Mountain settled into that strange category of American events that are too large to vanish completely and too uncomfortable to be remembered properly. It was the largest armed labour uprising in the nation's history, one of the greatest domestic conflicts since the Civil War, and yet for generations many Americans heard almost nothing about it. That silence was not accidental. Stories about workers facing machine guns, private planes, and federal troops do not fit easily into the clean version of progress. They complicate the picture. They ask who paid for prosperity. They ask why law and property so often stood together before they stood with the people whose bodies made wealth possible. And now, as the miners leave the ridge and the army holds the ground, the final part of the story begins to take shape. Not the battle itself, but what survived it. The broken Union drive, the trials, the silence that followed, the later revival of labour rights. The way Blair Mountain became buried, then rediscovered, then fought over again as memory, land, and history. Because the strange thing about a mountain is that even when the shooting stops, it remains where it was. Trees grow over trenches. Rain softens disturbed soil. Shell casings sink into the ground. Men die. Companies change names. But the mountain stays, holding what happened there long after the country has tried to look away. When the miners came down from Blair Mountain, they did not come down as men who had won. They came down carrying the weight of a fight that had become larger than any one of them could have controlled. Some had surrendered their rifles to federal troops. Some had hidden weapons in the woods before walking away, because a rifle was valuable, and because a man who had already risked being marked did not always feel generous toward the authorities, asking him to hand over the last thing he owned that made him feel less helpless. Some returned quietly, trying not to be noticed. Some were arrested. Some went home to company towns where the same houses stood, the same store ledgers waited, the same mine openings led into the mountain, and the same question hung over everything. What now? That is the part of a battle that history often handles too quickly. The shooting stops, the troops arrive, the men disperse, and the page turns. But for the people who lived through it, the end of gunfire did not mean the end of consequence. A miner who had marched could not simply become anonymous again. Too many men had seen him. Too many names had been spoken. In a coal camp, where privacy had always been thin, returning from Blair Mountain must have felt like walking back into a room where everyone knew what you had done, and no one knew yet what it would cost. His wife may have been relieved first. Relief is practical. Relief says he is alive. He is at the door. He has not been brought home in a wagon or left somewhere under the trees. Then relief would have had to make room for fear. Was he wanted? Had he been named? Would the company fire him? Would guards come? Would there be arrests in the night? Would the family still have a roof by winter? The children would have watched the adults carefully. Children in coal camps knew more than adults wished they knew. They knew when voices lowered. They knew when their mother looked out the window too often. They knew when their father came home with a face that meant not to ask questions yet. A boy who had imagined the march as something brave and grand might now see the tired men coming back with torn clothes, dirty boots, empty hands, and eyes that did not match the stories. A younger child might only understand that the house had become tense, that neighbours were visiting, that someone's father had not returned, that men were being taken away, that the word treason was being said by adults as if it were a heavy object no one wanted to touch. Treason. That word landed hard in the coalfields after Blair Mountain. The state did not treat the miners only as workers who had joined an illegal march or fought an armed battle. It treated many of them as men who had risen against the authority of West Virginia itself. There is a cruelty in the scale of that accusation that deserves to be noticed. These were men who had spent years inside an industry that fed the state and the nation. They had dug the coal that powered trains, mills, factories, cities, and fortunes. Their backs and lungs had helped build the modern world that richer men occupied comfortably. Yet when they marched against the private power that ruled their lives, the language used against them became the language of betrayal. They were not simply disobedient workers. They were accused as enemies of the state. The trials that followed were part punishment, part warning, and part theatre. The state wanted to prove that the miners' uprising was not a legitimate labour struggle but a criminal rebellion. Prosecutors wanted leaders, names and convictions that could make the whole march appear as a conspiracy rather than a mass expression of desperation. Bill Blizzard became one of the most important defendants. He was young, forceful, closely associated with the miners who had moved toward Logan County, and his treason trial became a test of how the battle would be remembered in law. If Blizzard could be convicted of treason, then the state could say that Blair Mountain had not been a workers' revolt against repression, but an attack on government itself. But a courtroom is not always as obedient as the people who bring charges hope it will be. Blizzard's trial was moved away from the coalfields to Jefferson County, far from the southern mountains where the battle had taken place. There, in 1922, he was acquitted. That acquittal mattered deeply. It did not undo the defeat on the mountain. It did not restore the Union's strength in the southern coalfields. It did not bring back the dead or erase the fear that had settled over the camps. But it prevented the state from turning the most visible face of the miners' side into a convicted traitor. For miners and their supporters, the verdict suggested that even after everything, the story could not be sealed completely by the coal operators and their allies. A jury had heard the case and refused to call Blizzard's actions treason. Still, acquittal was not the same as victory. Legal cases drained the labour movement. Men who might have organised were defending themselves. Families who were already poor faced the costs of uncertainty. Union resources were spent on lawyers, travel, defence, and survival. Arrests and indictments created fear in places where fear had already done years of work. The companies did not need every miner imprisoned to weaken the movement. They needed the camps to understand that marching had consequences. They needed men to think twice before signing a card, hosting a meeting, or following another crowd south. In that sense, the aftermath of Blair Mountain was not only fought in courtrooms, it was fought inside every miner's private calculation about whether hope was worth the next risk. For the United Mine Workers, the immediate result in southern West Virginia was painful. The march had been stopped. Mingo had not been opened in the way the miners intended. The mine guard system had not vanished overnight. The non-union fields remained difficult to organise. Membership in the region fell sharply in the years that followed, and the union's momentum was badly damaged. That is one of the hardest truths of this story. The largest armed labour uprising in American history did not bring the miners the quick triumph they wanted. The men had marched farther than almost anyone expected. They had forced the country to look at the coalfields. They had faced machine guns, aircraft, armed defenders, and federal troops. And then many of them still had to go back underground, under conditions that looked too much like the ones they had marched to escape. There is no easy comfort in that. A person wants justice to move with a cleaner rhythm. Workers suffer, workers rise, workers win. But history does not always respect that kind of structure. Sometimes people risk everything and lose in the short term, Sometimes the immediate reward for courage is prison, hunger, blacklisting, or silence. Sometimes the victory comes later, after the people who paid the heaviest price have grown old or died. Blair Mountain belongs to that harder kind of history. If you measure it only by what the miners gained in September of 1921, it looks like a defeat. If you measure it by what it revealed, by what it preserved in memory, by how it exposed the violence underneath the company town, the story becomes more complicated. Because the battle did reveal something. It showed that the peace of the coalfields had never truly been peace. It had been control. A quiet camp was not necessarily a content camp. A man going to work every morning was not necessarily a free man. A family buying flour at the company store was not necessarily accepting the justice of the prices. A miner staying silent when guards passed was not necessarily loyal to the system. Blair Mountain pulled the hidden conflict into the open so dramatically that it could not be dismissed as a few radicals stirring up trouble. Thousands of men had moved. They had not moved because life was comfortable. They had moved because company rule had entered the mine, the house, the store, the road, the courthouse, and the future, and they had run out of faith that polite requests would break it. The coal operators understood this exposure, which is one reason the memory of Blair Mountain became so uncomfortable. It was easier for the powerful to remember the miners as violent than to remember the conditions that made violence feel to many of those miners like the last available language. It was easier to talk about law and order than to talk about private mine guards. It was easier to condemn rifles in workers' hands than to explain why armed company forces had patrolled the coalfields for years. It was easier to treat the battle as an eruption than to admit it was the result of a whole social order. So the story was pushed down. Not erased completely, because something that large does not vanish, but softened, avoided, left out, passed through families more than classrooms. That silence mattered. In many parts of America, people grew up knowing the names of generals, presidents, inventors, industrialists and tycoons, but never heard of the miners who marched on Blair Mountain. They learned about the growth of industry without learning enough about the bodies used to feed it. They learned that coal powered America without hearing much about the company towns where coal miners lived under private rule. They learned about prosperity as if prosperity were a building that rose by itself, not something dug out by men who coughed dust into handkerchiefs and worried about eviction if they spoke too loudly. Blair Mountain did not fit comfortably into the national story because it asked the wrong questions. It asked who the law protected when workers and owners collided. It asked whether private wealth could become a local government. It asked how far ordinary people could be pushed before the country stopped calling their obedience peace. For the coalfields themselves, the memory remained closer. Families told stories. Some told them proudly, some told them carefully, some did not tell them at all unless they trusted the person listening. A grandfather might mention the march only once. A grandmother might remember hiding food, waiting for news, or seeing men pass with red cloth around their necks. A child might hear that an uncle had been on the mountain, but not learn details until years later. In places where retaliation had been real, silence could be inherited like furniture. Not because people had forgotten, but because remembering out loud once carried a cost. That is one of the strange things about working-class history. The events are often preserved by people who had the least safety in preserving them. The coal companies also continued to change, though not always in ways miners wanted. The industry remained dangerous, boom and bust, and deeply tied to national demand. Mechanization would later reduce the number of miners needed, changing coal communities again. Wages and benefits would improve for many union miners in later decades, but the fear of losing work never disappeared completely. Coal towns learned that even victory could be unstable when a whole region depended on a resource controlled by distant markets and distant owners. The fight was never only about one contract or one mine. It was about whether the people of the coalfields would have any power over an economy that could use them, injure them, and leave them behind. Yet real changes did come. just not immediately enough for the men on Blair Mountain to enjoy them as the reward for their march. The Great Depression shook the entire country in the 1930s, and the New Deal changed the legal ground for organised labour. Federal policy began to recognise rights that miners had been demanding, bleeding for and being jailed over long before Washington was ready to grant them. Anti-union contracts were challenged. Collective bargaining gained new protection. The United Mine Workers grew stronger. In West Virginia, the mine guard system that had haunted the coal fields was eventually outlawed. When those changes came, they did not arrive like gifts from nowhere. They arrived over ground prepared by decades of struggle, and Blair Mountain was part of that ground. This is important because laws often look cleaner than the fights that made them necessary. A statute is printed in orderly language. A right to organise can be stated in a sentence. But behind that sentence are men evicted from company houses, families in tents, organisers beaten, miners blacklisted, gunfire in Matewan, Sid Hatfield dying on courthouse steps, red bandanas tied around sweating necks, rifles handed over to federal troops, and defendants sitting in court accused of treason. Reform often arrives dressed as reason, but it is pushed into the room by people who were told for years that their demands were unreasonable. When Union power expanded in the 1930s, miners in southern West Virginia could organise under conditions very different from those of 1921. That does not mean the old hostility disappeared. Coal operators did not suddenly become gentle. Work underground did not become safe by magic. Poverty did not vanish from Appalachia. But the balance shifted. A miner with a union behind him stood differently from a miner alone. A company that had to bargain could not rule quite as completely as a company that owned the house, hired the guards, set the store prices, and fired union men at will. The change was imperfect, contested, and uneven, but it was real. Men who had once risked death for the right to organise had helped create the moral pressure that later made organising harder to deny. And still, Blair Mountain itself remained. That may sound obvious, but it became another part of the story. A battlefield in a city is often marked quickly because the land is visible, visited, and claimed by institutions with money. A battlefield in the mountains can be covered by trees, crossed by logging roads, disturbed by mining, and forgotten by people who prefer other stories. For decades, historians, local residents, labour activists, archaeologists and preservationists fought to have Blair Mountain recognised and protected. They understood that the land was not just land. It held cartridge cases, trenches, positions, paths, and the physical memory of the miners' uprising. It held evidence of a fight that many powerful interests had little reason to celebrate. The later struggle over preserving Blair Mountain became almost a second battle, quieter than the first but still shaped by coal, money, memory, and power. The battlefield was listed on the National Register of Historic Places, then removed, then after legal battles and renewed review, its listing was reaffirmed. That fight tells you something about how history works. The Battle of 1921 was about whether miners could cross a mountain to challenge coal power. The preservation fight many decades later was about whether the memory of that crossing would be allowed to remain visible on the land. Even after the guns were gone, the mountain was still contested. There is something fitting and sad in that. Blair Mountain was fought over because of coal beneath and around the land. Then its memory was fought over because coal interests and preservationists understood the same thing from opposite sides. A landscape with a story is harder to treat as empty. If Blair Mountain is just timber and mineral value, then it can be measured in extraction. If it is also the place where thousands of miners confronted the power that ruled their lives, then it asks for a different kind of accounting. Not a sentimental one, a moral one. So what did the battle leave behind? It left defeat first. We should not soften that too much. The miners were stopped. Many went home to the same hard system. The unions suffered. The coal companies held their ground in the immediate aftermath. It left fear, because the state had shown how heavily it could come down when workers took up arms. It left trials and broken momentum and families who had to keep living in places where their resistance had been noticed. It left grief for the dead and anxiety for the living. But it also left proof that the company town was not natural, proof that miners were not passive, proof that private power could become so complete that working men would rather face machine guns than keep accepting it quietly. Proof that the language of American freedom could sound hollow in a coal camp where the company owned the house, the store, the guards, and the road. Proof that labour history is not only about contracts and wages, but about home, speech, dignity, law, memory, and the right to stand with others without being destroyed for it. It left a warning too. The richest men in America did not always need to appear personally in the coalfields. They did not need to stand at the mine mouth with a rifle. Their power travelled through companies, agents, sheriffs, courts, guards, railroads, banks, and political relationships. That is how large power often works. It puts distance between itself and the suffering that sustains it. Blair Mountain shortened that distance for a moment. It made the country see the armed edge of an economic system that usually preferred to present itself as ordinary business. And it left a question that still feels uncomfortably alive. How much control can an employer have over a worker's life before work stops being free in any meaningful sense? A paycheck alone does not answer that. A man can be paid and still trapped. He can sign a contract and still have no real choice. He can live in a house and still know the house can be used against him. He can be told he is free while every practical path out has been priced beyond his reach. The miners of Blair Mountain understood this without needing modern language for it. They knew the difference between earning a living and being enclosed by the place that paid you. Near the end of this story, it is worth returning not to the battlefield at its loudest, but to one miner walking home after it was over. He has been part of something enormous, but now he's alone again, or nearly alone, moving back through the hills toward a camp where smoke rises from chimneys, and the company's store still waits with its shelves and ledger. His red bandana may be in his pocket now. His rifle may be gone. His boots are worn. He is hungry. He may not know whether the march will be remembered as courage, foolishness, rebellion, or crime. He only knows what he felt when the men gathered, what he heard in the woods, what he thought when federal troops arrived, and what it cost to turn back. He goes home because there is nowhere else to go tonight. Inside the house, his wife sees him and begins measuring the future immediately, because that is what families do after history passes through them. There will be food to find, work to seek or keep, rumours to sort, names to protect, children to calm, debts to face. The battle has ended, but life has not paused to make room for reflection. Tomorrow the mine may still call men underground. Coal will still be loaded. Trains will still move. The nation will still burn what the mountains give up. But something has changed, even if it cannot be held in the hand. The silence after Blair Mountain is not the same silence as before. It contains the memory of thousands of workers who once decided that the richest men in their world had taken too much, and that if no one would open the road for them, they would try to open it themselves. That memory is what the battle left behind most of all. Not a simple victory, not a clean defeat. A memory with dirt on it, with arguments inside it, with grief and pride tangled together. A memory of men who were not saints, not symbols first, not perfect heroes arranged for a monument, but workers pushed into a corner by a system that mistook endurance for consent. They had lived under the company's roof, spent the company's scrip, passed the company guards, entered the company mine, and buried the company's dead. Then, for a few days in 1921, they stepped out of the role assigned to them and became something the country could not easily name. An army of miners, marching through their own mountains, asking whether America belonged only to the men who owned it, or also to the men who dug its wealth from the dark.